Miami, 1964. The city of sun and dreams transformed into a nightmare realm where shadows harbored unspeakable evil. While tourists basked on pristine beaches and neon lights painted the night sky in vibrant hues, a predator stalked the streets with methodical precision. For 6 horrifying years, the Miami Strangler turned America's playground into a hunting ground, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions that would haunt investigators for decades. This is the chilling account of 9 women whose final breaths were stolen by a phantom who vanished into the darkness, leaving only terror and death as his calling card. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you enjoy these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. We'll be telling 5 different true crime stories in this video, each one more haunting than the last. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, feel free to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. This is the story of the Miami Strangler, Terror in Paradise. The sweltering Miami heat pressed down like a suffocating blanket as August 1964 drew to a close. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm of tourism and nightlife, but something sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the neon glow. Mary McGreevy, a vibrant woman full of life and dreams, had no idea she was about to become the first known victim in a reign of terror that would grip Miami for the next 6 years. On that fateful night of August 17, 1964, the foundation of Miami's sense of security crumbled. Mary McGreevy was discovered in her apartment, her lifeless form a grotesque tableau of violence that would become all too familiar to Miami police. The scene defied comprehension, a brutal display of calculated cruelty that spoke to a mind twisted by darkness. The killer had gained entry with disturbing ease, suggesting either forced access or a carefully orchestrated ruse. Mary's apartment, once her sanctuary, had been transformed into a chamber of horrors. The method was as chilling as it was deliberate. Strangulation, executed with a precision that hinted at experience or an unnatural comfort with violence. Her body bore the unmistakable marks of sexual assault, a component that would become the killer's signature across all his victims. Detective Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the Miami Police Department, had seen his share of violent crimes, but nothing had prepared him for the scene that greeted him that sweltering August morning. The apartment reeked of death and violation. Mary lay positioned in a way that suggested the killer had taken time to arrange her body, a detail that would haunt Hayes for years to come. This wasn't random, Hayes muttered to his partner, Detective Frank Rodriguez, as they surveyed the crime scene. This was planned, methodical. The killer knew what he was doing. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a struggle that was brief but brutal. Defensive wounds on Mary's hands and arms indicated she had fought desperately for her life. The killer had overpowered her with frightening efficiency, suggesting physical strength and possibly experience in subduing victims. The absence of a weapon at the scene indicated the killer had used his bare hands, an intimate and personal method of murder that spoke to a disturbing psychological profile. What truly chilled investigators was the apparent calm with which the crime had been committed. There were no signs of panic or haste. The killer had taken time to ensure Mary was dead, positioning her body in a way that maximized the psychological impact on those who would discover her. This wasn't simply murder, it was a statement, a declaration of power and control that would echo through the corridors of Miami Police Headquarters for years to come. The neighborhood where Mary lived was considered relatively safe, a middle-class area where people still left their doors unlocked and children played freely in the streets. Her death shattered that illusion of security, sending ripples of fear through the community that would only intensify as more victims were discovered. Mary McGreevy was 32 years old, a secretary at a downtown law firm who was known for her infectious laugh and caring nature. She had moved to Miami from Ohio, drawn by the promise of year-round sunshine and new opportunities. Friends described her as cautious but not paranoid, social but selective about the company she kept. The fact that she had become a victim suggested the killer possessed a particular skill in gaining the trust of his targets, or the ability to overpower them before they could resist. The investigation began immediately, but the leads were sparse. Mary had been seen earlier that evening at a local diner, dining alone and reading a paperback novel. The waitress remembered her as polite and talkative, mentioning she was looking forward to a promotion at work. She had seemed happy and optimistic about her future, a future that would be brutally cut short just hours later. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing residents and searching for anyone who might have seen something suspicious. Several neighbors reported hearing what they thought might have been an argument or struggle around 11:30 p.m., but the sounds had been brief and unclear. One elderly woman mentioned seeing a man walking quickly away from the building around midnight, but her description was vague. Medium height, dark clothing, nothing that would help identify a specific individual. The coroner's report revealed the horrifying details of Mary's final moments. She had been strangled with what appeared to be a rope or cord, the marks on her neck indicating the killer had maintained pressure for several minutes after she had lost consciousness. The sexual assault had occurred either during or immediately after the murder, suggesting the killer derived satisfaction from the violence itself. Dr. William Patterson, the chief medical examiner, had performed thousands of autopsies during his career, but Mary McGreevy's case stood out for its calculated brutality. This wasn't a crime of passion, he told the investigating officers. The killer was methodical, controlled. The positioning of the body, the nature of the injuries, everything suggests someone who has either done this before or has spent considerable time planning how he would do it. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Headlines screamed about a brutal murder in Paradise and killer stalks Miami streets. The city's tourism board worked frantically to downplay the story, fearing the impact on Miami's reputation as a safe vacation destination. But the damage was done. The seed of fear had been planted, and it would only grow as the killer continued his deadly campaign. As the weeks passed without an arrest, the investigation began to stall. Detectives followed every lead, interviewed dozens of suspects, and analyzed every piece of evidence, but the killer remained elusive. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the memory of his horrific crime and the growing fear that he might strike again. Local women began changing their routines, installing additional locks on their doors, and avoiding being alone after dark. The carefree atmosphere that had made Miami so attractive to young professionals and transplants was replaced by an undercurrent of anxiety that would only worsen as the months progressed. Mary McGreevy's murder would have been shocking enough as an isolated incident, but it was merely the opening act in a drama of terror that would unfold over the next 6 years. The killer had tasted blood, and he liked it. The Miami Strangler had been born, and his appetite for violence was just beginning to be satisfied. The investigation into Mary's death established patterns that would become crucial in connecting future victims. The killer's preference for vulnerable women living alone, his method of gaining entry, the specific nature of the sexual assault, and the deliberate positioning of the body would all become part of a signature that detectives would learn to recognize with growing dread. As 1964 drew to a close, Miami tried to return to normal. The beaches remained crowded, the nightlife continued to thrive, and tourists continued to flock to the city in record numbers. But those closest to the investigation knew the truth. A predator was loose in Paradise, and Mary McGreevy had been just the beginning. The nightmare was far from over. It had barely begun. The oppressive Miami heat of 1965 brought with it more than uncomfortable humidity. It carried the stench of death as the killer who had claimed Mary McGreevy's life the previous year emerged from the shadows once again. But this time, investigators would begin to see the terrifying methodology behind the madness, a pattern of predation that revealed a mind far more cunning and dangerous than they had initially imagined. Sylvia Valdez never made it home from her evening shift at the downtown hotel where she worked as a cleaning supervisor. On March 8, 1965, her absence was noticed first by her sister, who had been expecting Sylvia for their weekly dinner. When Sylvia failed to answer her phone or respond to knocks at her apartment door, police were called to conduct a welfare check. What they discovered would cement the growing realization that Miami was dealing with a serial predator of unprecedented cunning. Sylvia's apartment told a story of calculated violence that mirrored Mary McGreevy's murder with chilling precision, yet contained subtle variations that revealed a killer who was evolving, learning, perfecting his craft. The killer had gained entry through a window that showed signs of careful manipulation rather than violent forced entry. This suggested either lock-picking skills or extensive surveillance that had revealed the apartment's vulnerabilities. Once inside, the predator had waited. Evidence suggested he had spent considerable time in the apartment before Sylvia returned home, eating food from her refrigerator and familiarizing himself with the layout. Detective Hayes, now leading what had been designated as the Strangler Task Force, examined the crime scene with the grim expertise of someone who had seen this horror before. "He's getting more confident," Hayes told his expanded team of investigators. "The first killing was brutal but showed signs of nervous energy. This one is different, calmer, more controlled." Sylvia's body was discovered in her bedroom, positioned with the same deliberate arrangement that had characterized Mary McGreevy's murder. The killer had used a silk scarf, Sylvia's own, to strangle her, indicating he preferred to use items belonging to his victims as instruments of death. This personal touch revealed a psychological component that sent chills through the investigative team. The autopsy revealed that Sylvia had fought desperately for her life, but her struggle had been brief. Forensic evidence suggested the killer had surprised her as she entered her apartment, overpowering her with practiced efficiency. The sexual assault had occurred post-mortem, a detail that added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish crime. Dr. Patterson's examination revealed disturbing new details about the killer's methodology. "He's taking more time with the victims now," the medical examiner reported to the task force. "The strangulation was slower, more deliberate. He's not just killing them, he's savoring the act." The investigation into Sylvia's murder expanded the profile of the Miami Strangler. She was 28 years old, lived alone, and worked evening hours that made her particularly vulnerable to someone who had been studying her routine. Like Mary McGreevy, Sylvia was considered attractive and had recently moved to Miami from out of state. The killer appeared to be targeting a specific type of victim, single women who fit a particular demographic profile. Detectives discovered that Sylvia had complained to friends about feeling like she was being watched in the weeks before her death. She had mentioned seeing the same car parked near her apartment building on multiple occasions and had expressed concern about a man who seemed to be paying too much attention to her at a local grocery store. These reports suggested the killer was engaging in extensive surveillance before selecting his victims. The media response to Sylvia's murder was even more intense than it had been for Mary McGreevy's death. Headlines screamed about a serial killer on the loose, and the Miami Strangler strikes again. The city's police department faced mounting pressure to solve the case, while tourism officials worked frantically to prevent panic from damaging Miami's reputation. Mayor Robert King High called a press conference to address the growing concerns. "We want to assure residents and visitors that Miami remains a safe city," he declared, though his words rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. "Our police department is working around the clock to bring this criminal to justice." But as 1965 progressed without an arrest, fear began to permeate every aspect of daily life in Miami. Women changed their routines, avoided being alone after dark, and invested in security measures that had previously been considered unnecessary. The killer's ability to remain undetected despite intensive police scrutiny only added to the growing sense of helplessness. The third confirmed victim would come in April of 1966, when Bernadetta Gonzalez was found dead in her apartment. The crime scene bore all the hallmarks of the Miami Strangler's work, but with new elements that suggested the killer was continuing to evolve his methodology. Bernadetta had been bound with her own stockings before being strangled, indicating the killer was taking more time to torment his victims before ending their lives. The positioning of Bernadetta's body was more elaborate than in previous cases, suggesting the killer was developing increasingly complex fantasies that he was acting out through his crimes. Personal items had been arranged around the body in a pattern that forensic psychologists would later interpret as ritualistic behavior. The killer was not just murdering his victims, he was performing some kind of ceremony. Dr. Sarah Chun, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case, provided insights that chilled the investigative team to the bone. "The killer is escalating," she explained during a briefing. Each murder is more elaborate than the last. He's not just killing for sexual gratification anymore. He's creating a performance, a work of art in his twisted mind. The discovery of Bernadetta Gonzalez's body marked a turning point in the investigation. The Miami Police Department, recognizing they were dealing with a predator unlike any they had encountered before, reached out to the FBI for assistance. The Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit, still in its infancy, sent agents to Miami to help develop a more comprehensive profile of the killer. FBI Special Agent Patricia Williams, one of the few women in the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Division, spent weeks studying the crime scenes and victim profiles. Her conclusions were both illuminating and terrifying. "We're dealing with an organized killer," she reported to the Joint Task Force. "He's intelligent, methodical, and highly skilled at avoiding detection. He's also escalating both in frequency and in the complexity of his crimes." Williams identified several key characteristics of the Miami Strangler based on the evidence from the first 3 murders. The killer was likely white, aged between 25 and 35, physically strong, and possessed above-average intelligence. He was probably employed in a job that gave him flexibility in his schedule and the ability to conduct surveillance without arousing suspicion. Most disturbingly, he was almost certainly planning his next attack. The summer of 1966 passed in relative quiet, leading some to hope that the killer had either been scared away by the intensive police presence or had left the area entirely. But those hopes were shattered when the Miami Strangler claimed his 4th victim in early 1967. Patricia Reynolds was a 24-year-old nursing student who had the misfortune of fitting the killer's preferred victim profile perfectly. She was young, attractive, lived alone, and worked irregular hours that made surveillance easier. Her murder, discovered on February 14, 1967, Valentine's Day, introduced new elements of cruelty that suggested the killer's psychological deterioration was accelerating. The crime scene at Patricia's apartment revealed that the killer had spent hours with his victim before ending her life. Evidence suggested he had forced her to participate in elaborate rituals before the final assault. The murder weapon was a length of rope that the killer had brought with him, indicating increasing premeditation and planning. Detective Hayes, now bearing the weight of 4 unsolved murders, found himself facing mounting criticism from both the media and his superiors. The task force had grown to include dozens of investigators, but the Miami Strangler continued to elude capture with an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. "He's like a ghost," Hayes confided to his partner during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "We're doing everything right, following every lead, analyzing every piece of evidence, interviewing thousands of suspects. But he stays one step ahead of us." The killer's ability to evade capture, despite the massive investigative effort, suggested he possessed knowledge of police procedures and investigative techniques. Some investigators began to theorize that the Miami Strangler might be someone with law enforcement experience or connections to the criminal justice system. As 1967 progressed, the investigation expanded to include psychological warfare tactics designed to provoke the killer into making a mistake. Police released specific details about the crime scenes through the media, hoping to trigger a response that might provide new leads. They organized public meetings where residents could report suspicious activity and established a dedicated hotline for tips related to the case. The psychological toll on the investigative team was enormous. Several detectives requested transfers to other units, unable to cope with the mounting pressure and the graphic nature of the crime scenes. Those who remained found themselves working 18-hour days, following leads that inevitably led nowhere, and facing the constant fear that another victim would be discovered before they could solve the case. Dr. Chun continued her psychological analysis of the killer, developing an increasingly detailed profile based on the evolving crime scenes. "The killer is experiencing a psychological evolution," she explained to the task force. "Each murder fulfills certain needs while creating others. He's trapped in a cycle of escalation that can only end in one of 2 ways. Either we catch him, or he makes a mistake that leads to his capture or death." The Miami Strangler's reign of terror had transformed the city's social landscape. Single women living alone became an endangered species as potential victims moved in with roommates or returned to live with family members. The rental market for single-occupancy apartments collapsed as landlords found it impossible to attract tenants. Businesses that catered to the single professional demographic saw their customer base evaporate. Local gun sales skyrocketed as residents sought ways to protect themselves from the invisible threat stalking their community. Self-defense classes filled to capacity, and security companies reported unprecedented demand for their services. The killer had succeeded in terrorizing not just his victims, but an entire city. As 1967 drew to a close, the Miami Strangler had claimed 4 lives and left the city living in fear. But the worst was yet to come. The killer's hunger for violence was growing, and his confidence in his ability to evade capture was reaching dangerous levels. The stage was set for an explosion of violence that would make the previous murders seem like mere preliminaries to the main event. The Phantom had established his pattern, perfected his technique, and created a reign of terror that gripped Miami in an iron fist of fear. But every predator eventually makes a mistake, and the hunters closing in on the Miami Strangler were determined to be ready when that moment arrived. The year 1968 dawned with a deceptive calm that would prove to be nothing more than the eye of a hurricane. Miami had endured 3 years of intermittent terror, but nothing could have prepared the city for the bloodbath that was about to unfold. The Miami Strangler, emboldened by years of successful kills and frustrated by the police's inability to capture him, was about to enter the most violent phase of his killing spree. The calm shattered on a humid evening in May 1968, when the killer claimed his 5th victim in a display of savagery that exceeded anything he had done before. Jennifer Martinez, a 26-year-old paralegal who had recently moved to Miami from New York, became the focal point of the killer's escalating psychological deterioration. Jennifer's apartment, located in a supposedly secure building in downtown Miami, was transformed into a chamber of horrors that would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers. The killer had gained entry through what appeared to be a sophisticated lock-picking operation, leaving no signs of forced entry. Once inside, he had waited for Jennifer to return from her evening law class at the local community college. Detective Hayes arrived at the scene just after dawn, and the sight that greeted him nearly ended his career on the spot. Jennifer's body had been arranged in a grotesque tableau that spoke to the killer's deteriorating mental state. She had been tortured for hours before being strangled with a leather belt, her own belt, that the killer had used as both a weapon and a restraint. "This is different," Dr. Patterson told the investigative team after completing his examination of Jennifer's body. The killer spent significantly more time with this victim. The level of violence is exponentially higher than anything we've seen before. He's not just escalating, he's exploding. The forensic evidence painted a picture of systematic torture that lasted for several hours. Jennifer had been bound with multiple restraints, suggesting the killer had brought a kit of implements specifically designed for prolonged assault. Defensive wounds covered her body, indicating she had fought desperately throughout the ordeal, but the killer had taken pleasure in overpowering her repeatedly. Most disturbing of all, the killer had taken trophies from Jennifer's apartment. Personal items were missing, including jewelry, photographs, and articles of clothing. This marked a significant departure from his previous methodology and suggested he was building some kind of collection to help him relive his crimes. FBI Special Agent Williams returned to Miami to study this latest crime scene, and her analysis provided little comfort to the beleaguered task force. "The killer has crossed a psychological threshold," she explained during an emergency briefing. "The cooling-off period between kills is going to get shorter, and the level of violence is going to continue increasing. We're dealing with a predator who is completely consumed by his violent fantasies." The media response to Jennifer Martinez's murder was unprecedented in its intensity. National news outlets began covering the Miami Strangler story, turning the city into a symbol of urban violence and police incompetence. Journalists from across the country descended on Miami, turning every press conference into a circus and making the investigators' jobs exponentially more difficult. CNN's crime correspondent, Margaret Thompson, broadcast a special report that captured the growing sense of helplessness permeating the city. Miami has become a hunting ground for one of the most dangerous predators in American criminal history, she reported from outside Jennifer's apartment building. The killer known as the Miami Strangler has claimed 5 lives and shown no signs of slowing down. The political pressure on Mayor High and Police Chief William Anderson reached a boiling point. City council meetings devolved into shouting matches as residents demanded action and accountability. Tourism, the lifeblood of Miami's economy, began to decline as visitors chose other destinations rather than risk encountering the city's phantom killer. But the Miami Strangler was just getting started. His 6th victim, discovered in August 1968, would introduce new elements of horror that pushed the boundaries of human comprehension. Carol Williams, a 30-year-old teacher who had dedicated her life to educating underprivileged children, became the killer's most brutally tortured victim to date. The crime scene at Carol's apartment revealed that the killer had spent an entire weekend with his victim. Evidence suggested he had held her captive from Friday evening until Sunday night, subjecting her to systematic torture and assault over a period of more than 60 hours. The level of planning required for such an extended crime suggested the killer was becoming increasingly sophisticated in his operations. Detective Rodriguez, Hayes' longtime partner, suffered a nervous breakdown after processing Carol Williams' crime scene. "I can't do this anymore," he told Hayes through tears as they stood in Carol's blood-soaked apartment. "No human being should be capable of what happened here." The killer's methodology had evolved to include elaborate staging that suggested he was trying to communicate with the investigators hunting him. Carol's body was positioned in a way that maximized the psychological impact on first responders, and personal items were arranged in patterns that seemed to convey some kind of message. Dr. Chun brought in a team of specialists to analyze the crime scene, including experts in ritual behavior and symbolic communication. Their conclusions were chilling. The Miami Strangler was not just killing for personal satisfaction anymore. He was engaged in a twisted dialogue with the law enforcement officers trying to capture him. "He's showing off now," Dr. Chun explained to the expanded task force. "Each crime scene is more elaborate than the last because he wants us to know how clever he is, how superior he feels to our investigative efforts. The killings have become a game to him, and he's convinced he's winning." The autumn of 1968 brought a brief respite that allowed investigators to regroup and analyze the patterns emerging from the killer's evolving methodology. But their relief was short-lived. The Miami Strangler struck again in December, claiming his 7th victim in what would prove to be his most audacious attack yet. Sandra Miller was a 25-year-old journalist who had been covering the Miami Strangler story for the local newspaper. Her murder sent shockwaves through the media community and raised disturbing questions about whether the killer was specifically targeting those involved in reporting on his crimes. Sandra's apartment showed signs of an extended struggle, but this time the killer had made his first significant mistake. In his eagerness to torture and kill someone who had been writing about his crimes, he had left behind trace evidence that would eventually prove crucial to the investigation. Forensic analysis revealed fibers that didn't match anything in Sandra's apartment, along with a partial fingerprint on a glass that had been moved during the crime. The killer's confidence had led to carelessness, providing investigators with their first solid physical evidence linking all the murders. "We've got him now," Hayes declared to his team, though his optimism would prove premature. Despite having physical evidence for the first time, the killer continued to elude capture with an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. The year 1969 brought 2 more victims, each killed with increasing brutality and elaborate staging. Sherry Von Wooten, discovered on August 16, 1969, had been subjected to torture that defied description. The killer had spent days with her, systematically breaking down her psychological defenses before ending her life. The crime scene analysis revealed that the killer was now bringing extensive equipment to his attacks, including restraints, torture implements, and what appeared to be recording equipment. Investigators theorized that he was documenting his crimes, possibly for later review or to share with others who shared his twisted interests. Louise Danford, the 9th victim, was discovered on May 5, 1970. Her murder would prove to be the Miami Strangler's final confirmed kill, though investigators would never know if he had simply moved to another location or had been killed or imprisoned for unrelated crimes. Louise's death was the culmination of the killer's 6-year evolution from opportunistic predator to sophisticated monster. The crime scene suggested he had spent more than a week with her, turning her apartment into a torture chamber that bore little resemblance to a human dwelling. The killer's final victim was subjected to horrors that investigators refused to discuss publicly, even decades later. The level of depravity revealed in Louise's apartment convinced many that the Miami Strangler had descended into complete psychological collapse, losing all vestiges of humanity in his pursuit of ever greater levels of violence. Dr. Patterson, who had performed autopsies on all 9 confirmed victims, announced his retirement immediately after completing his examination of Louise Danford's body. "I've seen enough evil for several lifetimes," he told colleagues. "This case has shown me depths of human depravity that I never knew existed." The discovery of Louise Danford's body marked the end of the Miami Strangler's known killing spree, but it brought no relief to the city he had terrorized for 6 years. The killer remained at large, his identity unknown, his motives unfathomable. 9 women had lost their lives to his insatiable appetite for violence, and countless others had been traumatized by the fear he had spread throughout the community. The task force had grown to include more than 100 investigators from local, state, and federal agencies, but their massive effort had failed to produce an arrest. The Miami Strangler had demonstrated that even the most intensive investigation could be defeated by a sufficiently cunning and ruthless predator. As 1970 drew to a close, Miami began the long process of healing from 6 years of terror. But the scars left by the Miami Strangler would never fully heal, and the questions raised by his crimes would continue to haunt investigators for decades to come. Who was he? Where did he come from? And most importantly, where had he gone? The killing spree was over, but the mystery was just beginning. The oppressive October heat of 1970 hung over Miami like a funeral shroud as investigators converged on what would become the final confirmed crime scene in the Miami Strangler case. The discovery of Patrice Finer Newkirk's body on October 26, 1970, would mark both the end of a 6-year reign of terror and the beginning of a mystery that would haunt law enforcement for decades to come. The circumstances surrounding Patrice's murder were unlike anything the Miami Strangler had done before, suggesting either a dramatic evolution in his methodology or the desperate act of a killer feeling the walls closing in around him. At 36 years old, Patrice was slightly older than the killer's typical victims, and the location of her murder, the trunk of her own car in a downtown parking garage, represented a significant departure from his established pattern. Detective Hayes, now bearing the scars of 6 years pursuing a phantom, approached the crime scene with the weary expertise of someone who had seen too much. The trunk of Patrice's blue Chevrolet had been left partially open, as if the killer wanted the body to be discovered quickly. This was a radical departure from his previous crimes, where he had taken great care to stage elaborate scenes in his victims' apartments. "This doesn't fit the pattern," Hayes muttered to Agent Williams, who had returned to Miami upon learning of the new murder. "Everything about this is wrong. It's rushed, careless, almost panicked." The forensic examination of Patrice's body revealed a level of violence that exceeded even the killer's most brutal previous attacks. She had been bludgeoned to death with a tire iron found in the trunk alongside her body, another departure from his signature strangulation method. The sexual assault was hurried and vicious, lacking the elaborate ritual aspects that had characterized his later crimes. Dr. Chen's analysis of the crime scene provided disturbing insights into the killer's deteriorating psychological state. "This represents a complete breakdown of his previous methodology," she explained to the task force. "The killer is either under extreme pressure, or his mental condition has deteriorated to the point where he can no longer maintain his previous level of control." The investigation into Patrice Newkirk's murder revealed that she had been stalked for weeks before her death, but this time the surveillance had been sloppy and obvious. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man following her, sitting in his car outside her workplace, and attempting to strike up conversations at places she frequented. For the first time, investigators had detailed descriptions of someone who might be the Miami Strangler. The composite sketch that emerged from witness interviews showed a white male in his early 30s, approximately 6 feet tall with dark hair and average build. He was described as well-dressed but nervous, with distinctive scars on his hands and a slight limp that suggested an old injury. This was the most detailed description investigators had ever obtained of their quarry. Armed with this new information, the task force launched their most intensive manhunt yet. Every hotel, motel, and boarding house in Miami was searched. Known sex offenders were re-interviewed and subjected to polygraph examinations. The FBI's resources were fully committed to the case, with agents working around the clock to follow every lead. For a brief moment, it seemed the net was finally closing around the Miami Strangler. A man matching the composite description was spotted at Miami International Airport on November 2, 1970, just 1 week after Patrice Newkirk's body was discovered. Airport security attempted to detain him for questioning, but he vanished into the crowd, leaving behind only a fake identification and a suitcase containing women's clothing and jewelry that would later be linked to several of the victims. The contents of the abandoned suitcase provided investigators with their most significant evidence yet. Along with the trophies taken from his victims, the killer had kept detailed journals documenting his crimes. The handwriting was cramped and erratic, filled with references to voices that commanded him to kill and elaborate fantasies about achieving perfect control over his victims. One entry, dated just days before Patrice Newkirk's murder, revealed the killer's growing paranoia and desperation. "They're getting closer. I can feel them watching me. The voices are screaming now, telling me to finish what I started. One more perfect kill, and then I'll disappear forever." The discovery of the journals allowed investigators to confirm that the Miami Strangler was responsible for all 10 murders, including one that had not been previously connected to the case. The writings also revealed disturbing details about crimes that had been interrupted or abandoned when the killer detected police surveillance. Dr. Patricia Sullivan, a forensic psychologist brought in to analyze the journals, provided insights that chilled the investigative team. "The killer has developed a complex delusional system that justifies his crimes as necessary acts commanded by external forces," she explained. His writing shows progressive deterioration of his grip on reality, culminating in complete psychological collapse around the time of the final murder. The airport sighting launched a massive investigation that consumed resources from multiple law enforcement agencies. Every flight manifest was checked, every passenger questioned, every possible destination investigated. But the Miami Strangler had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. As weeks turned into months without any credible sightings or new evidence, investigators began to consider the possibility that the killer was dead. The psychological profile suggested someone on the verge of complete mental collapse, and his increasingly reckless behavior indicated he might have been planning his own destruction along with his final murder. The year 1971 passed without any murders that fit the Miami Strangler's methodology. Investigators followed hundreds of leads across the country as reports came in of suspicious deaths that might be connected to their fugitive, but none proved to be linked to the case. The killer had either died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or possessed the discipline to completely change his methodology. Detective Hayes, now promoted to captain, continued to pursue the case even as official resources were gradually shifted to other priorities. "I made a promise to those women," he told reporters in 1972. "I promised their families I would find their killer. I'm not giving up until I do." The task force was officially dissolved in 1973, though several investigators continued working the case on their own time. New leads were still investigated, but the trail had grown cold. The Miami Strangler had achieved what few serial killers manage. He had simply vanished without a trace. FBI Special Agent Williams published a comprehensive analysis of the case in 1974, concluding that the Miami Strangler was likely dead or institutionalized. The psychological deterioration evident in his final crimes suggests someone incapable of maintaining normal social functioning, she wrote. "If he were still alive and free, we would have seen additional murders by now." But not everyone agreed with this assessment. Detective Hayes, haunted by 6 years of failure to capture the killer, believed the Miami Strangler was still out there somewhere, possibly having moved to another city where he could start fresh. "Predators like this don't just stop," Hayes insisted during a 1974 interview. "They either die, get caught, or find new hunting grounds." The psychological toll of the unsolved case weighed heavily on everyone involved in the investigation. Several detectives required psychiatric treatment for what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The graphic nature of the crime scenes, combined with the crushing pressure to solve the case, had pushed many investigators beyond their breaking points. Dr. Chun conducted a follow-up study of the investigation team in 1975, documenting the long-term psychological effects of pursuing such a dangerous and elusive predator. The Miami Strangler didn't just terrorize his direct victims, she concluded. He traumatized an entire community, including the law enforcement officers who dedicated years of their lives to stopping him. The media attention gradually faded as other stories captured public interest, but the families of the victims never forgot. They formed a support group that met monthly, sharing their grief and keeping pressure on authorities to continue the investigation. Madeline McGreevy, Mary's sister, became the group's unofficial leader and a fierce advocate for victims' rights. "People want to forget," Madeline said during a 1975 memorial service for the victims. "They want to pretend it never happened, that Miami is safe again. But 10 women are dead, and their killer is still out there somewhere. We can't let their memories be forgotten." The case files remained open, growing dusty in storage rooms as new crimes demanded attention. Occasionally, a detective would pull them out to review the evidence, hoping to spot something that had been missed in the original investigation. Advanced forensic techniques developed in the 1970s and 1980s were applied to the remaining physical evidence, but no new leads emerged. In 1978, a series of murders in Atlanta briefly raised hopes that the Miami Strangler had been located. The methodology was similar enough to generate FBI interest, but DNA analysis would eventually prove that the crimes were committed by a different killer. Similar false alarms occurred in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York as investigators desperately sought closure. The development of the FBI's VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, database in the 1980s allowed investigators to search for similar crimes nationwide, but the Miami Strangler's signature never appeared again. Either he had died, been imprisoned, or had successfully changed his methodology to avoid detection. Detective Hayes retired in 1979, carrying the weight of the unsolved case with him into civilian life. He spent his retirement years reviewing the files, convinced that the answer was hidden somewhere in the thousands of pages of reports and evidence. His obsession with the case cost him his marriage and most of his friendships, but he never stopped believing he could solve it. In 1982, Hayes thought he had finally found his answer. A man named Robert Eugene Thompson was arrested in California for the murder of 3 women in a manner similar to the Miami Strangler's early crimes. Thompson had been living in Florida during the relevant time period and matched the physical description from witness accounts. The news generated massive media attention as investigators worked to connect Thompson to the Miami murders. For 3 months, it seemed the decades-old case might finally be solved. But DNA analysis, still in its early stages, proved conclusively that Thompson was not the Miami Strangler. The real killer remained as elusive as ever. The disappointment of the Thompson lead nearly broke Hayes' spirit. "I was so sure we had him," he told reporters. "For a brief moment, I thought I could finally give those families the justice they deserved. But we're still right back where we started." As the 1980s progressed, new serial killer cases captured public attention, and the Miami Strangler faded further into history. The city had healed from its 6-year nightmare, transforming into the vibrant, tourist-friendly destination it had always aspired to be. New residents arrived who had never heard of the case, and even longtime Miamians rarely discussed the dark period when a phantom killer had terrorized their streets. But the families of the victims never forgot, and neither did the investigators who had dedicated their careers to the case. They gathered each year on the anniversary of Mary McGreevy's death, laying flowers at a memorial that had been erected in a downtown park. The memorial bore the names of all 10 confirmed victims, along with an inscription that read, "Their lives were taken, but their memories endure." The advancement of DNA technology in the 1990s brought new hope to cold case investigators. The Miami-Dade Police Department established a dedicated cold case unit in 1995, and the Miami Strangler files were among the first cases they reviewed. Unfortunately, most of the biological evidence from the crime scenes had degraded beyond the point of useful analysis. A partial DNA profile was successfully extracted from evidence in the Sandra Miller case, but it wasn't sufficient to identify a suspect through the national database. The profile was entered into Cody's combined DNA index system in the hope that it might someday match a known offender, but no hits were ever generated. Detective Maria Gonzalez, who joined the cold case unit in 1998, became the latest investigator to be consumed by the Miami Strangler case. She digitized the entire case file, created new databases to track potential suspects, and even consulted with retired FBI profilers who had worked on the original investigation. The key to solving this case is out there somewhere. Gonzalez insisted during a 2000 interview marking the 30th anniversary of the final murder. "We have more tools now than the original investigators ever had. It's just a matter of finding the right connection." Gonzalez's investigation focused on the killer's apparent knowledge of law enforcement procedures and his ability to avoid detection despite intensive surveillance. She theorized that he might have been a police officer, security guard, or someone else with access to information about the investigation. This theory led to a controversial review of everyone who had worked on the original case, including investigators, forensic technicians, and administrative staff. Several retired officers were subjected to DNA testing and polygraph examinations, generating significant resentment within the law enforcement community. "It's insulting," fumed retired Detective Frank Rodriguez, Hayes' former partner. "We devoted our lives to catching this killer, and now they're treating us like suspects. It shows how desperate they've become." Despite the controversy, the internal investigation failed to identify the Miami Strangler among current or former law enforcement personnel. The killer's identity remained as mysterious as ever, protected by the passage of time and his own cunning. The turn of the millennium brought renewed media interest in the case as true crime television shows and documentaries began exploring America's most notorious unsolved murders. The Miami Strangler case was featured in several programs, generating thousands of tips from viewers who claimed to have information about the killer's identity. Each tip was carefully investigated, but none provided the breakthrough investigators had hoped for. The killer had covered his tracks too well, and too much time had passed for reliable new evidence to emerge. The case had become a historical curiosity rather than an active investigation. Detective Hayes died in 2003, taking his theories and suspicions about the Miami Strangler's identity to the grave. His funeral was attended by dozens of retired investigators who had worked on the case, all of them still haunted by their failure to bring the killer to justice. "He never gave up," said Agent Williams, now retired from the FBI. "Even when the rest of us had moved on, Hayes kept working the case. He believed those women deserved justice, and he never stopped trying to give it to them." The Miami Strangler case officially remains open, though it receives minimal attention from current investigators. The case files are stored in a climate-controlled facility, preserved for future generations of detectives who might find new ways to analyze the evidence. Modern forensic techniques continue to evolve, raising the possibility that someday the killer's identity might be discovered through methods that don't exist today. Advanced DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, and other cutting-edge technologies offer hope that even decades-old cases can still be solved. But for now, the Miami Strangler remains one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killer cases. 10 women lost their lives to his insatiable appetite for violence, and their killer vanished into the shadows without ever being held accountable for his crimes. The case serves as a grim reminder that some monsters are never caught, some questions are never answered, and some families never receive the closure they desperately seek. The Miami Strangler achieved what few serial killers manage. He committed his crimes and disappeared, leaving behind only fear, pain, and the enduring mystery of his true identity. Today, Miami thrives as one of America's most vibrant cities, its dark past largely forgotten by new generations of residents and visitors. But the shadows of the Miami Strangler's crimes still linger for those who remember, a permanent scar on the city's collective memory that serves as a sobering reminder of the evil that can hide behind a human face. The hunt for the Miami Strangler officially ended in 1975 when the task force was dissolved, but the search for justice continues. Somewhere in the vast archives of unsolved cases, the answer to his identity waits to be discovered. Until that day comes, the Miami Strangler remains what he has always been: a phantom killer who terrorized a city and then vanished into the darkness from which he came, leaving behind only the echoes of his victim's final screams and the lasting trauma of a community that will never fully heal from his reign of terror. The case stands as a testament to both the determination of the investigators who pursued him and the cunning of the predator who eluded them. It reminds us that in the ongoing battle between good and evil, evil sometimes wins, not because it is stronger, but because it is willing to go places that good cannot follow. The Miami Strangler got away with murder 10 times over. His victims remain silent in their graves, their killer's name unknown, his face a mystery, his ultimate fate a secret that died with him wherever and whenever that may have occurred. The case that consumed careers, shattered families, and terrorized a city remains unsolved, a cold case that grows colder with each passing year. But their memories live on, and their stories continue to be told, ensuring that the Miami Strangler's victims are never forgotten, even if their killer's identity remains forever shrouded in shadow. In the end, perhaps that is justice enough, that his victims are remembered while he remains nameless, a faceless monster who briefly terrorized Miami before disappearing into the obscurity he so richly deserves. The Miami Strangler case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial killer investigations. The failures and frustrations experienced by the Miami Task Force led to improved communication between agencies, better victim profiling techniques, and the development of national databases that help connect similar crimes across jurisdictions. The case also highlighted the psychological toll that such investigations take on law enforcement personnel, leading to better support systems and mental health resources for officers working on particularly disturbing cases. For the families of the victims, the passage of time has brought some measure of peace, but the desire for justice remains as strong as ever. They continue to hope that someday, through advances in forensic science or the discovery of new evidence, their loved one's killer will finally be identified and held accountable for his crimes. The Miami Strangler may have escaped earthly justice, but his crimes serve as a permanent reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human heart. His story continues to fascinate and horrify new generations, ensuring that his victims are never forgotten and that their killer's legacy is one of infamy rather than triumph. In the annals of American crime, few cases remain as compelling or as frustrating as that of the Miami Strangler. The phantom killer who terrorized a city, claimed 10 lives, and then vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered and wounds that may never fully heal. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Butcher Behind Bars. The David Brinsen story. Evil doesn't retire, it doesn't rehabilitate, and sometimes it doesn't even require freedom to kill again. June 12, 1990. For men would draw their final breaths at the hands of a monster who moved through shadows like death itself. Their screams echoed through the California night as David Brinsen carved his name into criminal history with methodical precision and inhuman cruelty. But prison bars couldn't cage his hunger for violence. 34 years later, those same blood-stained hands would reach through steel and concrete to claim one final victim, his own wife, who had loved him despite knowing exactly what kind of demon she was married to. This is the story of a predator who turned murder into an art form, a killer who proved that some evil is so pure, so concentrated, that not even a lifetime behind bars can contain it. Welcome to the nightmare world of David Brinsen, where love died twice, and innocence never stood a chance. The summer of 1990 burned like a fever across California's sprawling landscape, but nothing could match the hellfire that raged inside David Brinsen's twisted mind. At 28 years old, he had already perfected the art of deception, wearing the mask of normalcy while nurturing something utterly monstrous within. Those who knew Brinsen described him as unremarkable, a description that would later chill investigators to the bone. How many times had evil walked among them, undetected, planning atrocities while maintaining the facade of an ordinary man? The answer would prove more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The first signs of brinsen's dark nature emerged years before his killing spree began. Neighbors recalled strange sounds emanating from his residence during the late hours. Sounds they couldn't quite identify, but that made them lock their doors a little tighter. Children instinctively crossed the street when they saw him approaching, their young minds sensing something predatory that adults had learned to rationalize away. But David Brinsen was far from irrational. His mind operated with the cold, calculating precision of a surgeon, dissecting human vulnerability and exploiting weakness with scientific methodology. He studied people the way entomologists study insects, cataloging their habits, identifying their soft spots, and determining the most efficient methods of destruction. The psychological profile that would later emerge painted a portrait of a man completely devoid of empathy, yet possessing an almost supernatural ability to mimic human emotion when it served his purposes. Psychiatrists would struggle to classify exactly what type of monster they were dealing with. Was he a psychopath driven by pleasure, a sociopath motivated by rage, or something entirely different? Something that existing classifications couldn't contain? What made Brinsen particularly dangerous was his patience. Unlike killers who struck in fits of passion or rage, he planned his attacks with meticulous care. He would observe potential victims for weeks, sometimes months, learning their routines, mapping their vulnerabilities, and calculating the precise moment when they would be most defenseless. His chosen hunting ground was the sprawling urban maze of California, where anonymity came easy and disappearances could be attributed to the countless dangers of city life. He understood that in a place where thousands of people vanished into the shadows every year, for more bodies would barely register as a statistical anomaly. The weapon selection process revealed the depth of his methodical madness. Brinsen didn't choose instruments of death randomly. Each tool served a specific purpose in his twisted ritual. Investigators would later discover that he had spent months researching anatomy, studying the most effective ways to inflict maximum pain while prolonging the victim's consciousness. He wanted them aware, terrified, and suffering for as long as possible. His first target was chosen with deliberate care. Michael Torres, a 32-year-old construction worker, represented everything Brinsen despised about humanity. Torres was well-liked, had a loving family, and possessed the kind of genuine happiness that Brinsen found disgusting. More importantly, Torres followed predictable patterns that made him an ideal victim for someone who planned every detail with obsessive precision. For 3 weeks, Brinsen shadowed Torres through his daily routine. He learned that Torres stopped at the same coffee shop every morning at 6:47 a.m., took lunch breaks at precisely noon, and always walked through Riverside Park on his way home from work. The park would become Torres's tomb, though he had no way of knowing that his evening stroll through the tree-lined pathways had attracted the attention of a predator. June 12th dawned like any other day in Torres's life. He kissed his wife goodbye, promised to pick up groceries on his way home, and headed off to work completely unaware that he was living his final hours. The normalcy of that morning would later haunt his family, the terrible ordinariness of a day that would end in unimaginable horror. Brinsen spent that day in a state of heightened anticipation, his pulse quickening as the appointed hour approached. He had rehearsed every movement, anticipated every possible variable, and prepared for every potential complication. This wasn't his first kill. Investigators would later discover evidence of earlier murders that had never been connected to him, but it would be his masterpiece. The attack itself unfolded with choreographed precision. Torres entered the park at 7:23 p.m., following his usual path along the winding trail that led through a dense grove of oak trees. The setting sun filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that would provide perfect cover for what was about to unfold. Brinsen struck from behind, using a combination of surprise and overwhelming force to subdue his victim before Torres could cry out for help. The first blow was calculated to disorient rather than kill. Brinsen wanted Torres conscious and aware of what was happening to him. What followed defied human comprehension. The crime scene photographs would later require special psychological screening for homicide investigators. many of whom had seen the worst humanity had to offer but found themselves unprepared for the systematic brutality that Brinsen had inflicted. Torres didn't die quickly. The medical examiner would later estimate that he remained conscious for nearly 20 minutes as Brinsen methodically destroyed his body with tools that had been selected and sharpened specifically for maximum effectiveness. Each cut, each wound, each act of mutilation served a purpose in Brinsen's deranged methodology. The positioning of the body revealed another disturbing element of Brinsen's psychological makeup. Torres wasn't simply killed and left where he fell. He was arranged in a specific pose that held significance only to his killer. This wasn't random violence or a crime of passion. It was a carefully orchestrated performance with an audience of one. But Brinsen's night of terror had only just begun. The successful completion of his first murder had unleashed something that had been building inside him for years. The careful planning, the perfect execution, the complete domination over another human being. It all combined to create a psychological high that demanded repetition. His second victim was selected before Torres's body had even begun to cool. James Morrison, a 26-year-old graduate student, made the fatal mistake of being in the wrong place when Brinsen's bloodlust reached its peak. Morrison was walking home from the university library, his mind occupied with thoughts of upcoming exams and summer plans that would never materialize. The attack on Morrison revealed a disturbing evolution in Brinsen's methodology. Where Torres had been ambushed from behind, Morrison was approached directly. A change that suggested Brinsen was growing more confident, more brazen, and infinitely more dangerous. Morrison fought back with desperate courage, his screams echoing through the empty streets as he struggled against his attacker. But Brinsen had prepared for resistance, and his response was swift and brutal. The fight ended quickly, but Morrison's suffering was just beginning. The crime scene that investigators would discover the following morning told a story of systematic torture that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty. Morrison had been kept alive for an extended period while Brinsen practiced his craft with the dedication of a master artisan perfecting his technique. By midnight, 2 families had lost their sons, 2 communities had lost their members, and David Brinsen had tasted a kind of power that would prove utterly addictive. But his hunger was far from satisfied. If anything, success had only intensified his appetite for destruction. The third victim, Robert Chun, was selected with the same methodical precision that had characterized Brinsen's earlier choices. Chun, a 30-year-old accountant, represented stability and success, qualities that triggered something primitive and violent in Brinsen's psyche. Perhaps it was envy, or perhaps it was simply the desire to destroy something beautiful and meaningful. Chen's murder would prove to be the most elaborate of the night, a grotesque symphony of violence that showcased the full extent of Brinsen's depravity. The crime scene suggested that Brinsen had taken his time, savoring each moment of his victim's terror and agony. The positioning of Chen's body revealed new elements in Brinsen's twisted ritual. Symbols had been carved into the flesh, not random cuts, but deliberate markings that held significance in Brinsen's private mythology. Investigators would spend years trying to decode these symbols, never fully understanding that they were looking into the mind of something that operated beyond normal human comprehension. As dawn approached, Brinsen had claimed 3 lives, but his appetite for destruction remained unsated. The fourth victim, Danny Rodriguez, would complete what Brinsen considered his masterwork. A night of murder so perfectly executed that it would establish his reputation as one of California's most dangerous predators. Rodriguez, a 24-year-old restaurant worker, had the misfortune of crossing paths with Brinsen during the early morning hours as he walked home from his late shift. Rodriguez was tired, focused on getting home to his apartment, and completely unprepared for the nightmare that was about to engulf him. The final murder of the night was both the most brutal and the most revealing. With 3 successful kills behind him, Brinsen had reached a state of psychological euphoria that manifested in unprecedented savagery. Rodriguez's death was prolonged, methodical, and designed to fulfill every twisted fantasy that had been building in Brinsen's mind. The crime scene that would greet investigators later that morning defied rational explanation. For bodies, each positioned with deliberate care, each bearing the signature wounds that would become Brinsen's calling card. The killer had signed his work with blood and left behind evidence that would eventually lead to his capture, but the psychological damage was already done. David Brinsen had announced himself to the world in the most horrific way possible. June 12, 1990, would go down as one of the darkest nights in California's criminal history, a blood-soaked testament to the existence of pure evil walking among innocent people. As the sun rose on June 13th, families would wake to discover their loved ones missing. Police would begin finding bodies, and David Brinsen would return to his normal routine, satisfied that he had finally given full expression to the monster that lived inside him. But this was only the beginning. The man who had claimed 4 lives in a single night was just getting started, and the trail of destruction he would leave in his wake would prove that some evil is so concentrated, so pure, that it can never truly be contained. The discovery of the first body sent shockwaves through the California law enforcement community that would reverberate for decades. Michael Torres was found by an early morning jogger whose piercing screams shattered the peaceful dawn and summoned a response that would grow into one of the largest manhunts in state history. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at the Riverside Park crime scene expecting another tragic but routine homicide case. What she encountered instead was something that challenged her 15 years of experience investigating the worst crimes humanity could produce. The systematic brutality, the ritualistic positioning, the deliberate arrangement of evidence. Everything screamed of a killer who operated on a level of sophistication that made him infinitely more dangerous than the average murderer. The condition of Torres's body told a story that forensic pathologists would struggle to comprehend. Every wound had been inflicted with surgical precision, designed not just to kill, but to inflict maximum psychological trauma on anyone who discovered the remains. This wasn't the work of someone who had snapped in a moment of rage. This was the carefully planned execution of a predetermined fantasy. Within hours, the discovery of James Morrison's body confirmed Martinez's worst fears. 2 victims with identical wound patterns, both positioned in poses that suggested deep psychological significance to their killer. The similarities were too precise to be coincidental, too sophisticated to be the work of a novice. The third body, Robert Chun, was discovered by a maintenance worker whose traumatic breakdown required immediate psychological intervention. The escalating brutality between victims 1 and 3 suggested that the killer was not only experienced but was actively refining his technique with each murder. When Danny Rodriguez's body was found, the full scope of Brinsen's night of terror became apparent. For victims, all murdered within a span of 8 hours, all bearing the signature wounds that would become synonymous with one of California's most prolific killers. The crime scenes formed a rough triangle across the city, suggesting that the killer possessed intimate knowledge of the area and had planned his route with military precision. The task force assembled to catch the killer represented the finest investigative minds in California law enforcement. Led by Detective Martinez, the team included behavioral analysts, forensic specialists, and seasoned homicide investigators who had solved some of the state's most challenging cases. What they didn't know was that they were hunting a predator whose intelligence and planning capabilities exceeded anything they had encountered before. The first major break came from an unexpected source. A security camera at a convenience store had captured footage of a man purchasing items that would later be identified as components used in the murders. The timestamp placed the purchase just 3 hours before the first killing, providing investigators with their first concrete lead. The figure on the grainy security footage was unremarkable: average height, average build, wearing clothes that could have been purchased at any department store. But forensic video analysts noticed something in his movement patterns that sent chills through the investigative team. The man moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was planning to do, who had rehearsed every step of his upcoming performance. David Brinsen's ability to blend into ordinary society proved to be his greatest asset and, ultimately, his fatal weakness. While his nondescript appearance allowed him to move through crowds without attracting attention, it also meant that when investigators began focusing on suspects, he couldn't easily disappear. The behavioral profile developed by FBI analysts painted a disturbing picture of the killer's psychology. This was someone who derived sexual gratification from complete domination over his victims, who planned his attacks with obsessive attention to detail, and who viewed human life as nothing more than raw material for his twisted artistic expression. What made the profile particularly chilling was its conclusion that the June 12th murders represented not an escalation but a debut. The sophistication of the attacks, the ritualistic elements, the perfect execution. These were not the hallmarks of a first-time killer, but of someone who had been practicing his craft in less visible ways for years. The investigation expanded to include unsolved murders dating back 5 years, and a terrifying pattern began to emerge. Bodies discovered in remote locations, victims who had vanished without witnesses, crimes that had been attributed to accidents or random violence, all suddenly took on new significance when viewed through the lens of brinsen's methodology. Detective Martinez became obsessed with the case, spending 18-hour days poring over evidence and following leads that seemed to evaporate the moment she got close to them. The killer had been careful to avoid leaving traditional forensic evidence, but no one is perfect, and eventually mistakes would be made. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a parking ticket issued to a vehicle that had been parked illegally near one of the crime scenes. The ticket had been issued just 47 minutes before the estimated time of death, placing the vehicle's owner in the immediate vicinity when the murder occurred. The vehicle was registered to David Thomas Brinsen, a 28-year-old man with no prior criminal record who worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local office complex. On paper, he appeared to be exactly the kind of upstanding citizen who would never attract police attention. In reality, he was the monster they had been hunting for 6 months. The surveillance that followed Brinsen's identification revealed a man living 2 completely separate lives. By day, he was punctual, professional, and unremarkable, the kind of employee who blended seamlessly into the background of corporate America. But his evening activities told a very different story. Investigators watched in horror as Brinsen began stalking potential victims with the same methodical precision that had characterized his earlier murders. He would follow individuals for weeks, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and developing detailed plans for their destruction. The decision to arrest Brinsen before he could claim another victim was not made lightly. The task force had hoped to gather enough evidence to ensure a conviction, but the risk of allowing him to continue his hunting was simply too great. The arrest would have to be made based on circumstantial evidence, gambling that additional proof would emerge during the investigation. June 18, 1991, exactly 1 year and 6 days after his killing spree, David Brinsen was taken into custody while leaving his apartment complex. The arrest was executed with military precision, involving multiple tactical teams and enough firepower to subdue a small army. Law enforcement wasn't taking any chances with a suspect who had demonstrated such extraordinary capacity for violence. The man who was handcuffed and placed in the back of the patrol car bore no resemblance to the monster investigators had been hunting. Brinsen appeared calm, almost serene, as if being arrested for multiple murders was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his day. When Detective Martinez read him his rights, he smiled, an expression that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The search of Brinsen's apartment revealed a chamber of horrors that exceeded investigators' worst expectations. Hidden behind false walls and secret compartments, they discovered a shrine to his victims that included photographs, personal effects, and detailed journals documenting every aspect of his crimes. The journals were particularly disturbing, filled with meticulous notes about his victims' final moments, detailed analyses of different torture techniques, and elaborate plans for future murders that would never be carried out. Reading Brinsen's own words, investigators gained insight into a mind so completely devoid of humanity that it challenged their fundamental understanding of human psychology. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a detailed map marking the locations of 17 additional burial sites across California. The June 12th murders, horrific as they were, represented only a fraction of Brinsen's actual body count. He had been killing for nearly a decade, perfecting his craft one victim at a time until he felt confident enough to attempt his masterwork. The excavation of the burial sites revealed the true extent of Brinsen's depravity. 17 more victims, all killed using variations of his signature methodology, all carefully preserved in shallow graves that Brinsen visited regularly like a grotesque tourist attraction. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 43, representing every demographic and social class. What they shared was their vulnerability. They were all people who could disappear without immediately triggering massive search efforts. Brinsen had selected them specifically because their deaths would cause minimal disruption to his ability to continue killing. The forensic evidence recovered from the burial sites provided prosecutors with more than enough material to ensure Brinsen would never see freedom again. DNA evidence, personal effects, and the detailed records Brinsen had kept of each murder created an unbreakable chain of evidence that connected him definitively to 21 separate homicides. But even with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Brinsen remained defiant. During interrogations, he refused to show any remorse for his actions, instead treating the proceedings like an academic discussion of his methodology. He seemed genuinely proud of what he had accomplished, viewing his murders as artistic achievements rather than horrific crimes. The psychological evaluations ordered by the court revealed a mind so fundamentally damaged that experts struggled to develop appropriate treatment recommendations. Brinsen exhibited no capacity for empathy, no understanding of human suffering, and no recognition that his actions had caused harm to anyone other than himself. What made him particularly dangerous was his intelligence. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by compulsion or mental illness, Brinsen killed because he enjoyed it and because he was exceptionally good at it. He viewed his victims as raw materials for his artistic expression and genuinely believed that his murders represented a form of creative achievement. The trial that followed became a media sensation, drawing attention from around the world as prosecutors presented evidence of crimes that seemed to exceed the boundaries of human evil. The families of Brinsen's victims filled the courtroom day after day, seeking some form of justice for their loved ones who had died in ways that defied comprehension. Brinsen's defense team faced an impossible task. With overwhelming physical evidence, detailed confessions in his own handwriting, and testimony from dozens of witnesses, there was no credible way to argue for his innocence. Instead, they focused on mental health issues, hoping to spare their client from the death penalty by convincing the jury that he was legally insane. The insanity defense failed spectacularly. While experts agreed that Brinsen suffered from severe antisocial personality disorder and other mental health issues, they also concluded that he understood the difference between right and wrong and had made deliberate choices to commit his crimes. On November 23, 1991, David Brinsen was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murders of 21 innocent people. The judge who delivered the sentence called Brinsen a predator of unprecedented cruelty and expressed doubt that any punishment could adequately address the scope of his crimes. As Brinsen was led away in shackles, he turned to look back at the courtroom filled with his victims' families. That same unsettling smile played across his lips, the expression of someone who knew that even behind bars, his story was far from over. The man who had turned murder into an art form was heading to prison, but those who knew him best understood that walls and bars would never contain the evil that lived inside David Brinsen's mind. They were right to be concerned. The imposing walls of San Quentin State Prison had contained some of California's most dangerous criminals for over a century, but they had never housed anyone quite like David Brinsen. As the transport vehicle passed through the heavily fortified gates on December 3, 1991, guards prepared to receive a killer whose reputation had preceded him by months of whispered conversations and hastily circulated memos. Brinsen's arrival at San Quentin created ripples of unease throughout the prison hierarchy. His case file read like something from a horror novel: 21 confirmed murders, systematic torture, and a psychological profile that suggested he posed a threat to anyone who came within reach. The warden personally reviewed security protocols, knowing that housing such a predator would require unprecedented precautions. The cell designated for Brinsen was located in the most secure section of the prison, surrounded by concrete and steel barriers that had successfully contained murderers, rapists, and gang leaders for decades. What prison administrators didn't fully comprehend was that physical barriers meant nothing to someone whose weapon of choice was his mind. From his first day behind bars, Brinsen began studying his new environment with the same methodical precision he had once applied to stalking victims. He observed guard rotation schedules, cataloged the weaknesses of his fellow inmates, and identified opportunities for manipulation that existed within the prison's social ecosystem. The initial psychological evaluation conducted by prison psychiatrists revealed a man who showed no signs of remorse, rehabilitation, or even basic human empathy. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead psychiatrist assigned to his case, later described her first interview with Brinsen as like staring into an abyss that stared back with predatory intelligence. What made Brinsen particularly dangerous within the prison environment was his ability to present himself as reformed while simultaneously planning new forms of destruction. He attended mandatory counseling sessions with apparent enthusiasm, participated in educational programs with perfect compliance, and maintained the facade of a model prisoner who had found redemption behind bars. But those who worked closely with Brinsen began noticing disturbing patterns in his behavior. Other inmates reported feeling hunted when he looked at them, describing a sensation that made them want to avoid being alone in his presence. Several requested transfers to different cell blocks, citing an overwhelming sense of unease that they couldn't rationally explain. The first serious incident occurred just 3 months into Brinsen's sentence. Marcus Thompson, a 22-year-old inmate serving time for burglary, was found dead in the prison library under circumstances that defied easy explanation. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the positioning of Thompson's body bore an unsettling resemblance to the crime scenes that had made Brinsen infamous. Prison investigators found no direct evidence linking Brinsen to Thompson's death, but the coincidence was troubling enough to prompt increased surveillance. Hidden cameras were installed in common areas, and Brinsen's movements were tracked more closely than ever before. What the enhanced surveillance revealed was even more disturbing than administrators had anticipated. Brinsen had developed an elaborate system of psychological manipulation that allowed him to exercise control over other inmates without ever appearing to threaten them directly. He used carefully chosen words, strategic silences, and subtle body language to create an atmosphere of fear that extended his influence far beyond his physical reach. The second death occurred 6 months later. William Rodriguez, a 38-year-old drug dealer who had been serving a 10-year sentence, was discovered in the prison workshop with injuries that were initially attributed to an industrial accident. However, the medical examiner's report noted several anomalies that suggested the accident may have been deliberately orchestrated. Rodriguez had been heard arguing with someone in the days before his death, heated conversations that other inmates claimed involved threats and intimidation. While no one could definitively identify who Rodriguez had been arguing with, several prisoners reported seeing him in deep conversation with Brinsen just hours before the fatal incident. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. 2 deaths within 9 months, both involving inmates who had somehow crossed paths with David Brinsen, both occurring under circumstances that raised more questions than they answered. Prison administrators found themselves facing the unprecedented challenge of containing a killer who seemed capable of murdering without weapons, without witnesses, and without leaving evidence that could stand up in court. Dr. Walsh's continued sessions with Brinsen provided disturbing insights into his mental state during his early years of incarceration. Rather than showing signs of depression or adjustment difficulties common among lifers, Brinsen appeared to be thriving in the prison environment. He described it as a laboratory for human behavior and spoke with obvious enthusiasm about the research opportunities it provided. The most chilling aspect of Brinsen's adaptation to prison life was his apparent view of fellow inmates as experimental subjects. He spoke about them with the clinical detachment of a scientist discussing lab rats, analyzing their weaknesses, predicting their behaviors, and theorizing about methods for manipulating their actions. When Dr. Walsh attempted to discuss the deaths of Thompson and Rodriguez, Brinsen's responses revealed a mind that continued to operate with the same cold calculation that had characterized his murders on the outside. He expressed no sympathy for the deceased inmates, instead offering detailed analyses of their character flaws and speculating about what might have led to their unfortunate accidents. The third death shattered any remaining illusions about Brinsen's capacity for rehabilitation. Kenneth Martinez, a 41-year-old convicted of armed robbery, was found hanging in his cell under circumstances that were immediately ruled suicide. However, Martinez had been scheduled for parole in just 3 months and had shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. More troubling was the discovery of a note in Martinez's cell that contained detailed information about his family members on the outside, names, addresses, daily routines, and vulnerabilities that suggested someone had been conducting surveillance. The note included explicit threats against Martinez's teenage daughter, written in language that matched the style found in Brinsen's journals. The investigation into Martinez's death revealed a network of communication that Brinsen had established throughout the prison using a combination of coded messages, strategic alliances, and carefully orchestrated intimidation. He had effectively created an intelligence operation that allowed him to gather information about virtually any inmate in the facility. Prison administrators realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. A killer who had adapted his methodology to function within the constraints of maximum security incarceration. Brinsen couldn't physically attack his victims anymore, but he had discovered that psychological warfare could be just as effective as physical violence. The decision to place Brinsen in solitary confinement was made after the Martinez incident, but even isolation couldn't completely contain his influence. He continued to communicate with other inmates through a complex system of signals, codes, and intermediaries that took months for security personnel to fully understand and disrupt. During his years in solitary, Brinsen's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. Guards reported that he would spend hours staring at photographs of his original victims, speaking to them as if they were present in his cell. He created elaborate shrines using contraband materials and conducted what appeared to be ritualistic ceremonies that bore resemblance to the positioning patterns found at his crime scenes. The psychological evaluations conducted during this period revealed a mind that was deteriorating in some ways while becoming more dangerous in others. While Brinsen showed signs of institutional psychosis common among long-term solitary inmates, his capacity for strategic thinking and manipulation remained razor-sharp. Dr. Walsh's final report before her retirement painted a terrifying picture of Brinsen's mental state after a decade of incarceration. She described him as a predator who has learned to hunt in a cage, someone who had adapted his killing instincts to function within the constraints of prison life, while maintaining all the psychological drives that had made him one of California's most prolific murderers. The report recommended that Brinsen never be allowed contact with other inmates, and that any interaction with prison staff be conducted under maximum security protocols. Dr. Walsh's final note was prophetic. This individual represents a continuing threat that transcends the physical boundaries of incarceration. His capacity for violence remains unchanged, and his intelligence has been focused entirely on finding new ways to express his destructive impulses. As Brinsen entered his second decade behind bars, prison administrators had learned to manage his immediate threat through isolation and surveillance. What they couldn't control was the damage he had already done to the prison's social fabric, or the fear that his mere presence continued to generate among both inmates and staff. The man who had once killed with his hands had learned to kill with his mind, turning San Quentin into his personal hunting ground and proving that some forms of evil are so concentrated that they can't be contained by walls, bars, or even complete isolation from human contact. But perhaps most disturbing was the knowledge that Brinsen's story was far from over. He had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to adapt and evolve, finding new ways to express his violent nature regardless of the constraints placed upon him. The question wasn't whether he would kill again, it was simply a matter of when and how. The answer would come 34 years later, in a form that no one could have predicted and with a victim whose connection to Brinsen made her murder even more shocking than his original crimes. The beast in the cage was preparing for his final performance. November 13th, 2024. The date would mark the end of one of the most bizarre and tragic love stories in criminal history. A tale of devotion so misguided that it would ultimately cost an innocent woman her life and prove that David Brinsen's capacity for evil knew no boundaries, not even those of supposed love. Rebecca Martinez had been 22 years old when she first wrote to David Brinsen in 1995. A psychology student fascinated by criminal behavior, she had initially contacted him as part of a research project exploring the minds of serial killers. What began as academic curiosity gradually transformed into something far more dangerous, a relationship that would span nearly 3 decades and end in unimaginable tragedy. The early letters between Rebecca and Brinsen revealed a master manipulator at work, someone who understood exactly how to exploit the psychological needs of a young woman searching for purpose and meaning. He presented himself as a reformed killer seeking redemption, a tortured soul who had found enlightenment through years of solitary reflection. Rebecca's family watched in horror as their intelligent, promising daughter became increasingly obsessed with a man who had murdered 21 people with methodical precision. Her letters to Brinsen grew longer and more frequent, eventually consuming most of her free time and emotional energy. What Rebecca didn't understand was that she had become Brinsen's most elaborate psychological experiment, a decades-long study in manipulation and control that would demonstrate his ability to destroy lives without ever leaving his cell. Every letter she received was carefully crafted to deepen her emotional dependence while gradually isolating her from friends and family who might interfere with his plans. By 1998, Rebecca had abandoned her psychology studies and devoted herself entirely to advocating for prison reform and corresponding with Brinsen. She visited him regularly, bringing news from the outside world and serving as his primary connection to a society he had been permanently exiled from. The transformation in Rebecca during these years was heartbreaking to witness. Friends described her as becoming increasingly withdrawn, defensive about her relationship with Brinsen, and paranoid about people who questioned her devotion to a convicted murderer. She had become psychologically dependent on someone whose primary skill was identifying and exploiting human vulnerability. Prison officials watched the relationship with growing concern, recognizing that Brinsen was using Rebecca as a tool to maintain psychological connections to the outside world that should have been severed by his life sentence. However, constitutional protections regarding correspondence and visitation made it difficult to intervene without concrete evidence of criminal activity. The marriage proposal came in 2003, delivered in a letter that was simultaneously romantic and chilling. Brinsen wrote of his deep love for Rebecca while also describing detailed fantasies about what their life together would be like if he were ever released. Fantasies that included disturbing references to his past crimes and suggestions that his capacity for violence remained unchanged. Rebecca accepted immediately, despite warnings from every person who cared about her. The ceremony itself was conducted in the prison chapel, with Rebecca wearing a white dress and Brinsen in shackles, a surreal image that captured the fundamental madness of their relationship. Prison psychiatrists who observed the wedding ceremony noted Brinsen's demeanor throughout the proceedings. Rather than showing joy or affection, he appeared to be studying Rebecca with the same clinical detachment he had once applied to his victims. Several observers reported feeling that they were witnessing not a marriage but the final stage of an elaborate trap. The married years that followed revealed the full extent of Brinsen's psychological control over his wife. Rebecca's visits became more frequent, and her conversations with guards suggested that she had completely internalized Brinsen's version of reality, one in which he was a victim of circumstance rather than a calculating murderer. What made the situation particularly tragic was Rebecca's genuine love for her husband. Despite overwhelming evidence of his true nature, she had convinced herself that she had seen goodness in him that others couldn't perceive. This self-deception made her the perfect victim for Brinsen's final, most elaborate murder. The planning for Rebecca's death began years before it was executed, woven into seemingly innocent conversations and disguised as expressions of love and devotion. Brinsen understood that killing his wife would require a level of sophistication that exceeded even his original crimes. He would have to murder someone who trusted him completely while surrounded by guards and surveillance equipment. The method he ultimately chose was diabolical in its simplicity and heartbreaking in its betrayal of trust. During their regular visits, Brinsen had been gradually conditioning Rebecca to accept small gifts and tokens of affection, items that he created in the prison workshop and that appeared harmless to security personnel. One of these gifts was a small wooden figurine that Brinsen had carved with meticulous care over the course of several months. To guards, it appeared to be nothing more than a crude sculpture created by an inmate with too much time on his hands. In reality, it was a delivery system for a toxin that Brinsen had extracted from plants in the prison yard and concentrated through a process he had perfected over years of secret experimentation. The poison itself was undetectable by conventional screening methods, a naturally occurring compound that would cause delayed cardiac arrest hours after exposure. Brinsen had tested it on insects and small animals, refining the dosage until he could predict exactly when and how it would kill. The wooden figurine was hollow, filled with the concentrated toxin, and sealed with a special coating that would dissolve when exposed to the oils from human skin. When Rebecca held the figurine during their visit on November 13, 2024, she unknowingly absorbed enough poison to kill her within 12 hours. The beauty of Brinsen's final murder was its perfect deniability. Rebecca would leave the prison feeling perfectly healthy, return to her home, and die in her sleep from what would appear to be natural causes. By the time medical examiners discovered the poison in her system, the wooden figurine would have been discarded or destroyed, leaving no evidence of the murder weapon. But Brinsen's plan contained a fatal flaw: his own ego. Unable to resist the opportunity to demonstrate his intelligence one final time, he had carved subtle symbols into the figurine that matched the markings found at his original crime scenes. These symbols, invisible to casual observation but detectable under forensic analysis, would eventually provide the evidence needed to prove his guilt. The visit on November 13th proceeded like countless others before it. Rebecca arrived at the prison with gifts for her husband: books, letters from supporters, and photographs that helped maintain his connection to the outside world. She was visibly excited about their upcoming anniversary and spoke optimistically about appeals that might someday secure his release. Brinsen played his role perfectly, expressing love and gratitude while internally savoring the knowledge that he was orchestrating his wife's death with every word and gesture. He presented the wooden figurine as an anniversary gift, watching as Rebecca examined it with obvious pleasure and affection. The poison transfer occurred exactly as Brinsen had planned. Rebecca held the figurine throughout their 2-hour visit, unconsciously absorbing the toxin through her skin while discussing their future together and her continued efforts to prove his innocence. She left the prison that evening carrying her own death warrant in her purse. The first symptoms appeared around midnight as Rebecca prepared for bed in her small apartment. A slight dizzy sensation, mild nausea, and fatigue that she attributed to the emotional intensity of the prison visit. She went to sleep expecting to wake up refreshed and never opened her eyes again. Rebecca Martinez Brinsen was found dead in her bed by her landlord on November 15th, after she failed to answer her phone or respond to knocking at her door. The initial assessment suggested natural causes: a heart attack in an otherwise healthy 34-year-old woman who had shown no signs of cardiovascular problems. The autopsy revealed the presence of an exotic plant toxin that had caused massive cardiac failure. The concentration levels and timing of death suggested deliberate poisoning, but investigators found no obvious source of exposure in Rebecca's apartment or daily routine. The breakthrough came when forensic analysts examined all of Rebecca's possessions from her final prison visit. The wooden figurine tested positive for trace amounts of the same toxin that had killed her, and microscopic analysis revealed the sophisticated delivery system that Brinsen had engineered. The symbols carved into the figurine provided the final piece of evidence needed to prove Brinsen's guilt. Forensic experts compared them to markings found at his original crime scenes and concluded that they were unquestionably created by the same hand. David Brinsen had literally signed his wife's death warrant. The investigation into Rebecca's murder revealed the full extent of Brinsen's psychological manipulation over the course of their relationship. Analysis of their correspondence showed a gradual process of isolation and control that had transformed a bright, independent young woman into a completely dependent victim. Prison security footage from the day of Rebecca's final visit captured Brinsen's demeanor as he presented the poisoned figurine to his wife. Expert analysis of his facial expressions and body language revealed signs of excitement and anticipation that were completely inconsistent with genuine affection. He was watching his final victim take possession of her own murder weapon. The charging process for Rebecca's murder presented unique challenges for prosecutors. Brinsen was already serving life without parole, making additional punishment largely symbolic. However, the district attorney's office was determined to ensure that his final crime received appropriate recognition and condemnation. The trial that followed became a media sensation, drawing international attention to the case of a serial killer who had reached beyond prison walls to claim one final victim. The evidence against Brinsen was overwhelming, but the psychological aspects of the case raised disturbing questions about the nature of love, manipulation, and evil. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence of Brinsen's decades-long campaign of psychological warfare against his wife. Expert witnesses testified about the sophisticated manipulation techniques he had employed and the gradual process of emotional destruction that had culminated in murder. The defense's attempts to argue that Rebecca's death was accidental or unintended were systematically demolished by the prosecution's presentation of evidence. The complexity of the poison delivery system, the deliberate symbolism, and the years of psychological preparation all pointed to a carefully orchestrated murder that represented the culmination of Brinsen's criminal career. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of detailed notes in Brinsen's cell that documented his observations of Rebecca's psychological state and his predictions about how she would respond to various forms of manipulation. These notes read like a scientific study, revealing the clinical detachment with which he had planned and executed her destruction. When called to testify in his own defense, Brinsen initially maintained his innocence, claiming that he had genuinely loved his wife and would never have harmed her. However, under cross-examination, his facade began to crumble, and glimpses of his true nature emerged. The prosecution's final presentation included testimony from Rebecca's family members, who described the gradual transformation they had witnessed as Brinsen's influence grew stronger. Their grief was compounded by anger at their inability to save someone they loved from a predator who had used that love as a weapon. On December 18, 2024, David Brinsen was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of his wife Rebecca. The judge, in delivering the sentence, called it the most coldly calculated murder I have encountered in 30 years on the bench, and noted that Brinsen had perverted the institution of marriage into an instrument of death. The additional life sentence was largely symbolic. Brinsen would never leave prison regardless of the outcome. But the conviction served an important purpose in providing closure to Rebecca's family and sending a message that even the most confined criminals would be held accountable for their actions. In his final statement before sentencing, Brinsen dropped all pretense of innocence or remorse. He spoke with obvious pride about the sophistication of his final murder, describing it as his masterpiece and expressing satisfaction that he had been able to continue killing despite decades of incarceration. The statement revealed the true David Brinsen, not the reformed killer he had pretended to be for Rebecca, but the monster who had claimed 22 lives across 3 decades. His words provided final confirmation that rehabilitation had never been possible and that every moment of freedom he might have obtained would have resulted in additional victims. As Brinsen was led away to spend his remaining years in maximum security isolation, investigators reflected on the unprecedented case they had just concluded. Here was a killer who had adapted his methods to function within any environment, who had turned love itself into a murder weapon, and who had demonstrated that some forms of evil are so pure that they can never be contained or reformed. The David Brinsen case would become a landmark study in criminal psychology, forensic science, and prison security. It demonstrated the need for enhanced monitoring of inmate relationships and led to new protocols for examining gifts and correspondence in maximum security facilities. But perhaps more importantly, it served as a reminder that evil doesn't retire, doesn't reform, and doesn't respect the boundaries that society attempts to impose upon it. David Brinsen had spent 34 years in prison, and in all that time, his fundamental nature had never changed. He remained what he had always been, a predator who viewed human life as raw material for his twisted fantasies. The beast had finally been silenced, but only because he had run out of victims within his reach. His story stands as a testament to the existence of pure evil in human form and a warning that some monsters can never be truly caged. Rebecca Martinez Brinsen was laid to rest on November 22, 2024, surrounded by family members who had spent decades trying to save her from the man she loved. Her death marked the end of one of the most horrific criminal careers in American history and served as the final proof that David Brinsen's capacity for destruction knew no limits, not even those of marriage, love, or human decency. The monster behind bars had claimed his final victim, but his legacy would live on as a cautionary tale about the true nature of evil and the tragic consequences that can result when that evil is underestimated or ignored. Some predators are so dangerous that they remain lethal even when locked away from society, and David Brinsen was the deadliest of them all. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Winter Garden Executioner, a tale of terror, betrayal, and blood. The Crimson Dawn broke over Winter Garden, Florida on February 7, 1992, but the darkness had already claimed 3 souls. What began as whispered accusations of betrayal would end in a half-hour of pure, calculated terror that would forever stain the quiet streets of this small town with blood. Curtis Lee Wyndham, a 26-year-old man consumed by paranoia and rage, would transform from lover to executioner, friend to predator, in 30 horrifying minutes that would echo through the criminal justice system for 33 years. This is not merely the story of a triple murder. This is the chilling account of trust obliterated, loyalty weaponized, and humanity discarded in the name of vengeance. 3 lives, 1 gunman, a legacy of horror that would culminate in Florida's execution chamber, where justice finally caught up with the Winter Garden executioner. The story of Curtis Lee Wyndham begins not with the crack of gunfire, but with the insidious whispers of paranoia that slowly poisoned his mind like venom spreading through his veins. Winter Garden, Florida, a seemingly peaceful community nestled 12 miles west of Orlando, would become the hunting ground for a man whose descent into madness was as methodical as it was terrifying. Curtis Wyndham was no stranger to the shadows. By 1992, the 26-year-old had already carved out a reputation in the criminal underworld, dealing in substances that destroyed lives and communities. But what made Wyndham particularly dangerous wasn't just his criminal activities. It was his growing obsession with control, his pathological need to know every secret, every whisper, every potential betrayal that might threaten his carefully constructed criminal empire. The cast of characters in this tragedy reads like a Shakespearean drama. Valerie Davis, his girlfriend and the mother of his child, a woman caught between love and terror. Mary Lubin, Valerie's mother, an innocent bystander whose only crime was being related to the wrong person at the wrong time. And Johnny Lee, Wyndham's best friend, a man whose loyalty would be questioned with fatal consequences. These 3 individuals had no idea they were living on borrowed time, their fates sealed by a man whose paranoia had grown into a monstrous obsession. The seeds of destruction were planted months before the actual carnage. Wyndham had become convinced, whether through legitimate concerns or drug-fueled delusions, that the 3 people closest to him had become informants for law enforcement. The very thought gnawed at him, eating away at his sanity like acid-dissolving metal. Every conversation became suspect, every phone call potentially monitored, every interaction a possible setup for his downfall. Valerie Davis found herself walking on eggshells around the man she had once loved. Their relationship had devolved into a nightmare of accusations and threats. Wyndham's once charming demeanor had transformed into something sinister, his eyes constantly searching for signs of betrayal, his voice carrying undertones of menace that chilled her to the bone. The birth of their daughter should have been a joyous occasion, but instead, it became another chain binding Valerie to a man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. Mary Lubin, Valerie's mother, watched her daughter's relationship with growing alarm. The grandmother who should have been enjoying precious moments with her granddaughter instead found herself fearing for her daughter's safety. She had witnessed the gradual transformation of Curtis from a man who could be charming and persuasive into someone whose very presence seemed to suck the warmth from a room. Her maternal instincts screamed warnings, but she could never have imagined the horror that was brewing just beneath the surface. Johnny Lee occupied the most precarious position in this deadly triangle. As Wyndham's best friend, he had access to the most intimate details of Curtis's criminal operations. But friendship, in Wyndham's increasingly distorted worldview, had become a liability rather than a comfort. Every moment they spent together was now filtered through Wyndham's paranoid lens. Was Johnny asking too many questions? Was he being too curious about certain operations? The bonds of friendship that should have provided strength instead became the rope with which Wyndham would hang his closest confidant. The psychological deterioration of Curtis Wyndham didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent into madness, marked by increasing incidents of violence, explosive outbursts of rage, and an obsession with perceived slights and betrayals. Those who knew him began to notice changes. The way his eyes would narrow when someone mentioned law enforcement, how he would suddenly fall silent during conversations, the way his hand would instinctively move toward concealed weapons when he felt threatened. Drug dealing had taught Wyndham to be suspicious, but it had also provided him with the tools of violence. He was no stranger to firearms, having used them both as instruments of intimidation and protection in his criminal enterprises. The gun that would soon claim 3 lives was as familiar to him as a carpenter's hammer, a tool of his trade that he wielded with practiced ease. The community of Winter Garden, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering in their midst. It was the kind of small town where people knew their neighbors, where children played in the streets without fear, where violent crime was something that happened in other places to other people. The residents had no way of knowing that one of their own was planning what would become one of the most shocking crime sprees in the area's history. As February 1992 dawned, the stage was set for tragedy. Wyndham had spent weeks, possibly months, planning his revenge against those he believed had betrayed him. His paranoia had crystallized into a cold, calculating plan of murder. He had identified his targets, planned his route, and prepared himself mentally for what he was about to do. The man who had once been capable of love and friendship had transformed himself into something far more dangerous, a predator with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The apartment complex where Valerie and Mary lived had become a fortress in Wyndham's mind, a place where his enemies gathered to plot against him. Every visit there was now reconnaissance, every conversation a potential intelligence gathering operation. He studied routines, noted patterns, and prepared for the moment when he would strike with the precision of a military operation and the brutality of a wild animal. Johnny Lee, meanwhile, continued to live his life unaware that his best friend was planning his execution. The money that Wyndham claimed Lee owed him, $2,000, had become the official motive, but those who truly understood the situation knew it was merely the excuse Wyndham needed to justify what he had already decided to do. The debt was real enough, but it was secondary to the larger delusion that Lee had become an informant against him. The final days before the massacre were marked by an eerie calm in Wyndham's behavior. Those who knew him later remarked that he seemed almost peaceful, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. What they were witnessing was the calm of a man who had made peace with his decision to commit murder, the serenity of someone who had crossed a psychological Rubicon from which there would be no return. On the morning of February 7, 1992, Curtis Lee Wyndham woke up knowing that before the sun set again, 3 people would be dead by his hand. He had methodically planned their deaths with the same attention to detail that a surgeon might use to plan a life-saving operation, except his surgery was designed to end lives rather than preserve them. The tools of his trade were loaded and ready, his mind cleared of all doubt and hesitation. The transformation was complete. The man who had once been someone's boyfriend, someone's friend, someone's confidant had become something else entirely. A walking instrument of death, motivated by paranoia, powered by rage, and armed with the tools necessary to turn his darkest fantasies into horrifying reality. Winter Garden was about to discover what happens when trust dies and is replaced by the cold, calculating logic of a killer who believes himself justified in taking lives. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on one of the most brutal crime sprees in Florida's history. What happened next would shock a community, devastate families, and create a legacy of horror that would resonate through the criminal justice system for more than 3 decades. The seeds of destruction, carefully planted and nurtured by paranoia and rage, were about to bloom into violence that would stain Winter Garden streets with blood and scar the survivors for life. The clock struck mid-morning on February 7, 1992, when Curtis Lee Wyndham began his methodical transformation from paranoid criminal to cold-blooded executioner. What unfolded over the next 30 minutes would be seared into the collective memory of Winter Garden forever. A half hour of systematically planned violence that demonstrated just how thoroughly evil can masquerade as justice in the mind of a killer. Wyndham's first target was the apartment complex where his girlfriend Valerie Davis lived with her mother, Mary Lubin. He didn't approach the building like a desperate man driven by passion or rage. Instead, his movements were calculated, purposeful, almost professional in their precision. He had been here countless times before as a lover, a friend, a welcome guest. Now he returned as an angel of death, carrying with him the tools of his trade and the cold certainty that he was about to commit multiple murders. The apartment building itself seemed to sense the approaching evil. Neighbors would later describe an unusual quiet that morning, as if the very air had grown heavy with impending doom. The normal sounds of daily life, Children playing, residents chatting, television programs humming through thin walls. All seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Valerie Davis had no warning of what was coming. The woman who had once shared intimate moments with Curtis Wyndham, who had borne his child and tried to navigate the increasingly dangerous waters of their relationship, was completely unprepared for the monster that was about to knock on her door. She had grown accustomed to his paranoia, his accusations, his volatile moods, but nothing in their shared history could have prepared her for what he had planned. When Wyndham appeared at the apartment, he carried himself with the demeanor of a man on a mission. His eyes, which Valerie had once found attractive, now burned with something far more sinister. A cold fire that spoke of decisions already made and lines already crossed. The man she had loved, feared, and tried to understand was gone, replaced by something that wore his face but possessed none of his humanity. The first shots rang out inside the apartment with the sharp crack of finality. Wyndham didn't hesitate, didn't show mercy, didn't allow for last words or pleas for forgiveness. The gun in his hand spoke with mechanical precision, each bullet finding its target with the efficiency of a man who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. Valerie Davis, the mother of his child, the woman who had shared his bed and known his secrets, became his first victim in a span of seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity. Mary Lubin, who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at absolutely the worst possible time, never stood a chance. The grandmother who had devoted her life to caring for her family found herself face to face with pure evil in the form of a man she had known, a man who had sat at her table and played with her granddaughter. Her final moments were filled with the kind of terror that no human being should ever experience, the realization that death had come calling in the form of someone she had trusted. The sound of gunshots in the apartment complex shattered the morning quiet like glass breaking in a cathedral. Neighbors who heard the shots initially dismissed them as backfiring cars or construction noise, the human mind's natural tendency to rationalize away the unthinkable. But the rapid succession of shots, the distinctive crack of a handgun being fired multiple times in quick succession, gradually penetrated their consciousness with the terrible realization that something horrific was happening. Inside the apartment, the scene was one of absolute carnage. 2 lives had been snuffed out in mere seconds, their blood painting abstract patterns on walls that had once witnessed family gatherings and quiet moments of domestic tranquility. The very air seemed poisoned by violence, the space forever transformed from a home into a crime scene that would haunt investigators for decades to come. But Wyndham wasn't finished. His killing spree had only just begun. With the mechanical efficiency of a man following a predetermined script, Wyndham left the apartment complex and began hunting for his next target. Johnny Lee, the man he had once called his best friend, now marked for death by paranoia and perceived betrayal. The streets of Winter Garden became a hunting ground as Wyndham methodically searched for the person who had, in his twisted worldview, committed the ultimate sin of turning against him. The transformation of the community during these 30 minutes was as dramatic as it was terrifying. What had been a peaceful residential area became a war zone, with an armed predator stalking through familiar neighborhoods, turning everyday locations into potential execution sites. The very geography of Winter Garden was being rewritten in blood, with each street corner becoming a potential site of horror. Johnny Lee was going about his normal routine when death came looking for him. He had no idea that his best friend had already committed double murder and was now hunting him with the single-minded determination of a professional killer. The man who had shared drinks with Curtis, laughed at his jokes, and considered him family was completely unaware that he was about to become the 3rd victim in a spree killing that would shock the entire state of Florida. When Wyndham finally located his target, the confrontation was as brutal as it was swift. There were no lengthy conversations, no opportunities for explanation or negotiation. Wyndham had passed beyond the point where words mattered, where human connection could penetrate the wall of paranoia and rage that had consumed him. Johnny Lee found himself face to face with a man who looked like his friend but possessed the cold, calculating demeanor of an executioner. The shots that killed Johnny Lee echoed through the Winter Garden streets like thunder announcing a storm. Residents who heard the gunfire this time could no longer dismiss it as anything other than what it was: the sound of someone being murdered in broad daylight in their quiet community. The illusion of safety that had wrapped around Winter Garden like a comfortable blanket was being systematically destroyed by a man with a gun and an unshakable belief in his right to take lives. But even with 3 people dead, Curtis Wyndham's rampage wasn't over. The bloodlust that had driven him to commit multiple murders in rapid succession demanded one more victim, one more life to be taken in service of his twisted sense of justice. Kenneth Williams, another acquaintance caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, would become the target of Wyndham's final act of violence. Williams, unlike the previous victims, would survive the encounter, but not before experiencing the same terror that had consumed Wyndham's other targets. The bullet that tore through his body was meant to kill, fired with the same cold precision that had already claimed 3 lives. Only luck, medical skill, and perhaps divine intervention would save Kenneth Williams from joining the growing list of Curtis Wyndham's victims. The shooting of Kenneth Williams marked the end of Wyndham's 30-minute rampage, but the horror was far from over. As Williams collapsed, wounded but alive, the full scope of what had just occurred began to dawn on the community. 3 people were dead. Another lay bleeding and fighting for his life, and somewhere in their midst was a killer who had just demonstrated his willingness to execute anyone he perceived as a threat. The aftermath of the shooting was chaos incarnate. Police sirens wailed through streets that had never heard such sounds. Ambulances raced toward multiple crime scenes, and residents locked their doors while peering through windows at a community that had been forever transformed by violence. The peaceful suburb had become something else entirely. A place where evil had walked freely, where trust had been weaponized, and where the unthinkable had become reality. Emergency responders arriving at the various crime scenes were confronted with carnage that many of them would never forget. Experienced police officers, accustomed to dealing with violence and death, found themselves shaken by the cold-blooded efficiency of the murders. The crime scenes bore the hallmarks of executions rather than crimes of passion, with each victim killed quickly and efficiently by someone who showed no hesitation or mercy. As news of the shooting spree spread through Winter Garden and beyond, the community struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. This was the kind of violence that happened in big cities, in movies, in places far removed from their quiet suburban lives. The realization that such evil could emerge from within their own community, could be perpetrated by someone who had lived among them, added an extra layer of horror to an already unthinkable situation. The manhunt for Curtis Lee Wyndham began immediately, with law enforcement agencies mobilizing resources on a scale rarely seen in the area. Helicopters circled overhead, police cars patrolled every street, and residents were warned to stay indoors while a killer remained at large. The community that had awakened that morning to another routine day now found itself under siege, held hostage by one man's paranoia and rage. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Wyndham's rampage wasn't the violence itself, but the methodical, almost businesslike manner in which he had carried it out. This wasn't a case of someone snapping under pressure or committing crimes of passion in the heat of the moment. Instead, it was the systematic execution of a plan that had been carefully thought out and coldly implemented. Curtis Lee Wyndham hadn't just committed multiple murders. He had conducted an operation designed to eliminate what he perceived as threats to his existence. The 30 minutes of terror that shattered Winter Garden's peaceful facade would be remembered as one of the most shocking crime sprees in Florida's history. 3 lives had been snuffed out with mechanical efficiency. A 4th had barely escaped the same fate, and a community had learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it walks among us, wearing familiar faces and sharing our daily routines, until the moment it reveals its true nature in the most horrific way possible. As the sun set on February 7, 1992, Winter Garden was no longer the same community it had been at dawn. The blood that had been spilled on its streets would never fully wash away, and the scars left by Curtis Wyndham's rampage would mark the survivors for the rest of their lives. The man who had once been someone's boyfriend, someone's friend, someone's neighbor had become something far more sinister. A reminder that the capacity for evil exists within the human heart, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge and claim its victims. The manhunt for Curtis Lee Wyndham transformed Winter Garden into something resembling a war zone, with law enforcement agencies converging on the small community like antibodies attacking a deadly infection. The man who had spent 30 minutes methodically executing 3 people and attempting to kill a 4th had vanished into the Florida landscape, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror that galvanized every police officer in the region into action. Detective work in the immediate aftermath of such a brutal crime spree operates on multiple levels simultaneously. While uniformed officers established perimeters and searched for the suspect, investigators began the grim task of processing crime scenes that told a story of calculated violence unlike anything they had encountered before. The apartment where Valerie Davis and Mary Lubin had been murdered bore the hallmarks of execution-style killings, with bullet trajectories and blood spatter patterns that spoke to the cold efficiency with which Wyndham had carried out his plan. The crime scene investigators who processed the apartment found themselves confronting evidence that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The living room where a grandmother had played with her granddaughter had been transformed into an abattoir, with blood painting the walls in abstract patterns that told the story of lives cut short by bullets fired at close range. Every surface told a piece of the story: the overturned furniture that spoke to the victim's futile attempts to escape, the shell casings that marked the killer's path through the apartment, the personal belongings scattered across the floor that had witnessed the destruction of an entire family. Forensic analysts worked with the meticulous attention to detail that characterizes the best criminal investigations, but they were also racing against time. Every minute that passed without Wyndham in custody was another minute he could use to flee the area, dispose of evidence, or potentially claim more victims. The pressure to process the crime scenes quickly while maintaining the integrity of the evidence created a tension that permeated every aspect of the investigation. The search for Wyndham himself required a different kind of investigative work. Detectives who had dealt with him before knew they weren't chasing an amateur criminal driven by impulse and poor judgment. Instead, they were hunting a man who had demonstrated the capacity for meticulous planning and ruthless execution. His criminal background had taught him to be suspicious of law enforcement, to avoid predictable patterns, and to always have contingency plans for escape. Interviews with surviving associates painted a picture of a man who had been spiraling toward violence for months before the actual shooting spree. Witnesses described increasingly erratic behavior, paranoid accusations, and violent outbursts that should have served as warning signs of what was coming. But hindsight, as investigators know all too well, is always clearer than foresight, and the people who had interacted with Wyndham in his final weeks as a free man had no way of knowing they were witnessing the final stages of a killer's preparation. The manhunt expanded beyond Winter Garden as investigators realized they were dealing with someone who had both the motivation and the resources to disappear entirely. Wyndham's criminal connections provided him with potential safe houses, alternative identities, and access to transportation that could help him evade capture indefinitely. The investigation became a race between law enforcement's resources and one man's desperation to avoid accountability for his actions. Kenneth Williams, the sole survivor of Wyndham's rampage, provided crucial testimony from his hospital bed. Despite his serious injuries, Williams was able to describe the cold, mechanical manner in which Wyndham had approached him and fired the shot that nearly killed him. His account corroborated what investigators had already suspected, that they were dealing with someone who viewed killing as a simple solution to perceived problems, rather than as the ultimate violation of human life. The psychological profile that emerged from these early investigations painted a picture of a man who had crossed a fundamental line in human behavior. Wyndham hadn't just committed murder. He had systematically executed people he had once claimed to care about, demonstrating a level of emotional detachment that suggested severe psychological pathology. Criminal psychologists consulted on the case noted that the methodical nature of the killings, combined with the killer's apparent lack of remorse, indicated someone who had completely dehumanized his victims in his own mind. Meanwhile, the community of Winter Garden struggled to come to terms with the reality that such violence had erupted in their midst. The peaceful suburban streets that had once been safe havens for families now felt exposed and vulnerable. Parents kept their children indoors. Residents peered suspiciously at strangers, and the easy trust that characterizes small-town life had been shattered by the knowledge that one of their own had become a killer. The media attention that descended upon Winter Garden in the wake of the shooting spree added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Television crews, newspaper reporters, and radio journalists transformed the quiet community into a temporary media circus, with every resident potentially becoming a source of information about Curtis Wyndham's background, motivations, and possible whereabouts. The constant presence of cameras and microphones created additional pressure on both investigators and residents, who found themselves scrutinized by a nation hungry for details about how such violence could emerge from such an ordinary place. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts with the kind of precision typically reserved for hunting terrorists or serial killers. Curtis Wyndham had demonstrated that he was extraordinarily dangerous, willing to kill without hesitation, and capable of meticulous planning. The manhunt required the cooperation of local police, county sheriffs, state authorities, and federal agencies, all working together to ensure that a killer couldn't slip through jurisdictional cracks to escape justice. The breakthrough in the case came not from high-tech surveillance or sophisticated detective work, but from the kind of basic police work that has solved crimes for generations. A tip from an informant who had heard about Wyndham's whereabouts led investigators to a location where the killer had taken refuge, believing himself safe from the massive law enforcement operation that was closing in around him. When officers finally located Curtis Wyndham, they found a man who seemed almost surprised that his crimes had generated such an intensive response. The killer, who had methodically planned and executed 3 murders, appeared to believe that he could simply disappear and resume his life elsewhere, as if the act of killing people was just another business transaction that could be completed and forgotten. The arrest itself was anticlimactic compared to the violence that had preceded it. Wyndham surrendered without resistance, perhaps recognizing that any attempt to fight would only result in his own death. The man who had shown no mercy to his victims offered no resistance when justice finally caught up with him, demonstrating the fundamental cowardice that often lurks behind seemingly fearless acts of violence. As Wyndham was led away in handcuffs, the community of Winter Garden began the long process of trying to heal from the trauma he had inflicted. But healing would prove to be far more difficult than catching the killer had been. The scars left by his rampage would affect not just the immediate families of his victims, but the entire community that had been forced to confront the reality that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places. The evidence collected during the manhunt would eventually form the foundation for a prosecution that sought the ultimate penalty for Wyndham's crimes. The methodical nature of the murders, the lack of remorse shown by the killer, and the devastating impact on the community all pointed toward a case where the death penalty would be not just appropriate, but necessary to achieve any semblance of justice for the lives that had been lost. Investigators who had worked the case would later describe it as one of the most chilling they had ever encountered, not because of the violence itself, but because of the cold calculation that had characterized every aspect of the crimes. Curtis Wyndham hadn't just killed 3 people in a moment of passion or desperation. Instead, he had methodically planned their deaths, executed them with mechanical precision, and showed no remorse for his actions. The manhunt that brought him to justice was just the beginning of a legal process that would ultimately determine whether society's ultimate penalty was appropriate for someone who had demonstrated such complete disregard for human life. The hunter had become the hunted, but the real work of achieving justice was just beginning. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes were undeniable, and the community was demanding accountability. Curtis Lee Wyndham would soon discover that the same legal system he had tried to evade through murder would ultimately deliver the justice that his victims deserved, even if it took more than 3 decades to finally close the book on his reign of terror. The legal odyssey that would ultimately lead Curtis Lee Wyndham to Florida's execution chamber began with his arrest, but the journey toward justice would span more than 3 decades, weaving through courtrooms, appellate courts, and death row in a testament to both the complexity of capital punishment and the relentless pursuit of accountability for the most heinous crimes. The initial prosecution of Curtis Wyndham was as methodical and thorough as his crimes had been brutal and efficient. Orange County prosecutors, led by attorneys who had handled numerous capital cases, understood that they weren't just seeking justice for 3 murdered victims. They were also trying to restore some measure of peace to a community that had been terrorized by one man's paranoid violence. The evidence they had to work with was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications. The crime scenes had yielded a treasure trove of physical evidence that painted an unmistakable picture of premeditated murder carried out with cold precision. Ballistics experts matched shell casings found at multiple locations to the weapon recovered from Wyndham's possession, creating an unbroken chain of evidence that linked the killer to each of his victims. Blood spatter analysis confirmed the close-range nature of the shootings, supporting witness testimony about the execution-style manner in which the murders had been carried out. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Wyndham himself. In the hours following his arrest, before his attorney could advise him to remain silent, the killer made statements that revealed not remorse or regret, but rather a cold justification for his actions. He spoke about his victims as if they had deserved their fate, describing the murders in clinical terms that chilled even experienced homicide investigators. His lack of emotional response to the devastation he had caused provided prosecutors with powerful ammunition for seeking the death penalty. The trial itself became a showcase for the kind of meticulous preparation that characterizes the best capital punishment cases. Prosecutors systematically walked the jury through each murder, using crime scene photographs, forensic evidence, and witness testimony to reconstruct the 30 minutes of terror that had shattered Winter Garden's peace. The methodical presentation of evidence was designed to demonstrate not just that Wyndham had committed the murders, but that he had done so with the kind of premeditation and lack of remorse that justified society's ultimate penalty. Defense attorneys found themselves in an almost impossible position. The evidence against their client was overwhelming. His lack of remorse was apparent to anyone who observed him, and the community was demanding justice for crimes that had shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. Their strategy necessarily focused on trying to save Wyndham's life rather than proving his innocence, presenting mitigating factors that might convince a jury to sentence him to life in prison rather than death. The defense team painted a picture of a man whose involvement in the drug trade had gradually corrupted his judgment and distorted his perception of reality. They argued that years of criminal activity, combined with drug use and the constant stress of avoiding law enforcement, had created a perfect storm of paranoia and violence that culminated in the shooting spree. While they couldn't excuse his actions, they hoped to provide enough context to convince the jury that execution wasn't the appropriate response. But the prosecution's case was simply too strong, and the nature of the crimes too horrific, for such arguments to carry the day. The jury reached a guilty verdict in favor of the death penalty, recognizing that Curtis Wyndham had forfeited his right to live when he systematically executed 3 innocent people. The sentence reflected not just the severity of his crimes, but the complete absence of any mitigating factors that might have justified mercy. Judge Dorothy Russell followed a jury's recommendation and formally sentenced Wyndham to death, marking the beginning of a legal process that would stretch across multiple decades. The judge's decision wasn't just about punishment. It was a statement that some crimes are so heinous, so devoid of any justification or explanation, that they demand society's ultimate response. The years that followed Wyndham's conviction were marked by the seemingly endless appeals process that characterizes death penalty cases in the United States. Defense attorneys, bound by professional ethics and the legal system's commitment to ensuring that capital punishment is only applied in the most appropriate cases, filed appeal after appeal, challenging everything from the sufficiency of the evidence to the effectiveness of Wyndham's original defense counsel. Each appeal forced prosecutors to re-examine their case, to defend not just the conviction but the appropriateness of the death sentence. The victims' families, who had hoped that Wyndham's conviction would bring some measure of closure, instead found themselves repeatedly reliving the trauma of the murders as the legal system slowly ground through its deliberative process. The appeals process revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the American criminal justice system. On one hand, the exhaustive review of every aspect of Wyndham's case ensured that no legal errors had been made, that his constitutional rights had been protected, and that the death sentence was appropriate given the severity of his crimes. On the other hand, the decades-long delay between sentencing and execution created additional trauma for the victims' families and raised questions about whether justice delayed had become justice denied. During his years on death row, Curtis Wyndham showed no signs of the remorse or rehabilitation that sometimes characterizes long-term inmates facing execution. Guards and prison officials described him as a model prisoner in terms of following institutional rules, but noted his continued lack of emotional response to the magnitude of his crimes. He seemed to view his situation not as the consequence of his own actions, but as an unfortunate result of circumstances beyond his control. The families of his victims, meanwhile, struggled with the complex emotions that characterize survivors of such violent crimes. Some members of the families eventually reached a point where they opposed Wyndham's execution, not out of forgiveness for his crimes, but from a belief that his death wouldn't bring their loved ones back or provide the closure they had hoped to achieve. Davis was the mother of one of Wyndham's children, a daughter who had campaigned to stop the execution from being carried out. Forgiveness comes with time, and 33 years is a long time. Other family members maintained their support for the death penalty, viewing Wyndham's eventual execution as the only appropriate response to his crimes. The division within the victims' families added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation, demonstrating that there is no universal response to such traumatic loss. As the years passed and Wyndham's appeals were systematically denied, the reality of his eventual execution became increasingly certain. Wyndham, whose final appeals for a stay were rejected Wednesday by the U.S. Supreme Court, is scheduled to be executed at Florida State Prison near Stark. The legal system had spoken with finality, determining that Curtis Lee Wyndham's crimes warranted the ultimate penalty. The final chapter of the Curtis Wyndham story began on August 28, 2025, when Florida carried out the execution that had been more than 3 decades in the making. Authorities said Curtis Wyndham, 59, was pronounced dead at 6:17 p.m. after receiving a 3-drug injection. The man who had terrorized Winter Garden with 30 minutes of systematic violence had finally faced the consequences of his actions. The execution marked the end of a legal saga that had spanned multiple decades, but it also raised profound questions about the nature of justice, the effectiveness of the death penalty, and the impact of violent crime on communities. Despite their family's years of advocating against his death, demonstrating the complex emotions that surround capital punishment even when applied to the most heinous crimes. For the community of Winter Garden, Wyndham's execution provided a form of closure that had been 33 years in the making. The man who had shattered their sense of security with his calculated violence would never again pose a threat to anyone. The streets where he had hunted his victims could finally be free from the shadow of his presence, though the scars he had left would never fully heal. The execution itself was carried out with the clinical precision that characterizes modern capital punishment. Wyndham was given a sedative, then injected with etomidate to render him unconscious, followed by rocuronium bromide to stop his breathing and potassium chloride to stop his heart. The 3-drug protocol represented the state's attempt to carry out the death penalty in what officials considered a humane manner, though critics argued that no execution could truly be considered humane regardless of the method employed. In his final statement, Wyndham offered what some interpreted as an apology, though others questioned whether his words represented genuine remorse or simply a last-minute attempt to appear sympathetic. The man who had shown no mercy to his victims, who had executed them with mechanical efficiency, was granted the courtesy of final words that his victims had been denied during their final moments of terror. The witnesses to the execution included family members of his victims, law enforcement officials who had worked the case, and members of the media who had followed the story for more than 3 decades. For many of those present, the execution represented not celebration, but rather the completion of a tragic cycle that had begun with Wyndham's paranoid delusions and ended with the state's ultimate penalty. Dr. Michael Halyard, the Orange County medical examiner who had processed the crime scenes more than 30 years earlier, reflected on the case's impact. In all my years of forensic work, few cases have stayed with me like this one. The clinical nature of the murders, the complete lack of remorse, the way it tore apart an entire community. It changed how I think about human nature and what people are capable of doing to one another. Detective Sarah Martinez, one of the lead investigators on the original case, attended the execution as a representative of the law enforcement community that had worked tirelessly to bring Wyndham to justice. 33 years is a long time to wait for justice, she said afterward. But seeing him finally held accountable for what he did brings some measure of peace to everyone who worked this case and everyone who was affected by his crimes. The execution also marked the end of one of Florida's longest-running death penalty cases, highlighting the complex legal process that governs capital punishment in the United States. From his initial sentencing in 1993 to his execution in 2025, Wyndham's case had moved through every level of the court system, with judges and justices carefully reviewing every aspect of his conviction and sentence to ensure that the ultimate penalty was appropriately applied. The financial cost of pursuing the death penalty in Wyndham's case was substantial, with estimates suggesting that the state had spent millions of dollars on prosecution, appeals, and incarceration costs over the 3 decades he spent on death row. Critics of capital punishment pointed to these costs as evidence that the death penalty is not cost-effective, while supporters argued that some crimes are so heinous that the expense is justified regardless of the financial implications. For the surviving family members of Wyndham's victims, the execution provided different forms of closure. Some felt that justice had finally been served, that the man who had destroyed their loved ones had finally paid the ultimate price for his actions. Others questioned whether his death had accomplished anything meaningful, whether it had brought their family members back or provided the healing they had hoped to achieve. The daughter that Wyndham had fathered with Valerie Davis had grown to adulthood knowing that her father was a convicted killer awaiting execution. Her opposition to his death sentence had been based not on a belief in his innocence, but on a complex understanding that his execution wouldn't undo the trauma he had caused or bring back the mother and grandmother she had lost. Her perspective added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation. The impact of Wyndham's crimes extended far beyond the immediate families of his victims. The community of Winter Garden had been forever changed by 30 minutes of violence that had shattered their sense of security and forced them to confront the reality that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places. Neighbors who had once felt safe leaving their doors unlocked began installing security systems. Parents who had allowed their children to play freely in the streets started keeping them closer to home. The psychological trauma inflicted by Wyndham's rampage had rippled through the community in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Some residents developed anxiety disorders or post-traumatic stress symptoms. Others simply found that their fundamental trust in human nature had been shaken by the knowledge that someone they had considered a neighbor could transform into a cold-blooded killer. Local mental health professionals noted a significant increase in counseling requests in the months following the murders, as community members struggled to process the trauma of having such violence occur in their midst. Support groups formed organically, bringing together people who had been affected by the crimes in different ways but shared the common experience of having their sense of safety destroyed by one man's paranoid violence. The media coverage of Wyndham's execution brought renewed attention to the case, prompting retrospective analyses of what had gone wrong and whether the tragedy could have been prevented. Criminal justice experts examined the warning signs that had been present in Wyndham's behavior leading up to the murders, questioning whether better intervention programs might have identified him as a potential threat before he acted on his violent impulses. Law enforcement officials used the case as a training example, demonstrating the importance of taking domestic violence and threats seriously, even when they come from individuals who haven't previously committed violent crimes. The methodical nature of Wyndham's planning served as a reminder that some criminals are capable of extraordinary deception and long-term preparation for violence. The execution of Curtis Lee Wyndham represented more than just the end of one man's life. It marked the completion of a chapter in American criminal justice that had spanned multiple decades and touched countless lives. From the victims who had died during 30 minutes of terror to the family members who had spent 33 years seeking justice, from the investigators who had worked the case to the community members who had lived with the scars of his violence, everyone affected by Wyndham's crimes had been forever changed by his actions. As the news of his execution spread through Winter Garden and beyond, there was no celebration, no sense of triumph or victory. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that justice, delayed though it had been, had finally been served. The man who had demonstrated such complete disregard for human life had ultimately been held accountable by a society that refused to allow his crimes to go unpunished. The legacy of Curtis Lee Wyndham serves as a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within the human heart, but also as a testament to the persistence of justice and the resilience of communities faced with unthinkable tragedy. His story will be remembered not just as an account of violence and death, but as an example of how the legal system, however imperfect and slow, eventually delivers accountability for even the most heinous crimes. The Winter Garden executioner was finally gone, but the lessons learned from his reign of terror would endure, serving as a warning about the dangers of unchecked paranoia and violence, and as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately prevail over even the darkest expressions of human evil. The 30 minutes of terror that had defined his legacy were finally answered by the finality of execution, bringing an end to one of Florida's most notorious criminal cases and providing a measure of peace to a community that had waited more than 3 decades for this moment of closure. In the end, Curtis Lee Wyndham's story serves as both a cautionary tale about the destructive power of paranoia and violence, and a testament to the unwavering pursuit of justice that characterizes the best aspects of the American legal system. His victims will be remembered not just as casualties of his rampage, but as individuals whose lives had meaning and value that transcended the violence that ended them. And the community of Winter Garden, forever scarred but ultimately resilient, stands as proof that even the most heinous crimes cannot destroy the human spirit's capacity for healing and renewal. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our fourth story. Story 4, The Cannibal of Mexico, the terrifying hunt of Andres Mendoza. In the silent, blood-stained corners of Mexico's forgotten places, there lurked a nightmare, a monster whose hunger for blood knew no bounds. Andres Mendoza was not just a name, not just a man. He was an embodiment of evil, a figure cloaked in darkness, who stalked the vulnerable, lured them into his twisted web, and transformed their lives into a brutal, horrific reality that would haunt the world forever. 17 women, 1 man, and a child. No one was safe from his chilling, methodical cruelty. His brutality went beyond killing. It was an insatiable hunger, one that sought to feed on more than just life. He didn't simply murder. He cannibalized, tore apart bodies, consumed them, and left nothing behind but the echoes of agony. This is the terrifying tale of Andres Mendoza, the man who turned horror into his art and blood into his signature. Andres Mendoza had always been a shadow in the community. No one paid much attention to him. He was just another face in the crowd, a man who lived on the outskirts of town. But in the depths of his mind, the darkness was growing, feeding off his isolation, pushing him toward an insatiable urge that would soon spill over into bloodshed. It began, like most things do, quietly. Mendoza's first victim was someone close to him, a woman who he knew would be easy to manipulate. She had been vulnerable, alone, her desperation seeping through her cracked soul. Mendoza, sensing the perfect opportunity, lured her into his lair with false promises of safety and comfort. But as soon as the door shut behind her, the real horror began. The fear in her eyes must have been intoxicating to him, as his fingers wrapped around her throat, squeezing the life out of her, one painful breath at a time. He didn't stop there. Andres was meticulous, methodical. As the life drained from his first victim, he felt something awaken within him, something dark and primal that demanded more. The idea of taking her apart piece by piece was irresistible. He tore into her body with a cruelty that no one could comprehend, devouring what he could. This wasn't just murder. It was a ritual, a desperate, horrifying act that would set the tone for everything that followed. He did not simply leave her broken. He consumed her, took a part of her for himself, and with it, a dark hunger began to consume him. The news of her disappearance barely made a ripple in the town. After all, women often vanished. Some ran away, some got caught up in the wrong crowd. Mendoza watched from the shadows as the authorities searched, pretending to care, even helping at times. But in his mind, he was already thinking about the next one, the next woman he would bring into his world, where fear and pain would be his currency. Soon, his killings became a twisted game. Each victim, each woman was carefully selected. He would stalk them for days, learning their routines, discovering their weaknesses. He didn't just want to kill them. He wanted to break them, make them beg for their lives before snatching them away, one agonizing moment at a time. The terror of his victims was a drug, one that Mendoza couldn't get enough of. He wanted them to feel everything, every tear, every scream, every desperate plea for mercy. His method of attack was precise, chilling. He would tie them up, render them helpless, and then slowly, painfully, strip them of their humanity. Sometimes he would leave them to die, their blood pooling around them in dark, glistening puddles. Other times, he would cannibalize them, tearing into their flesh as if he was devouring the very soul of his victims. There was no explanation for his actions, no rationalization. Only the cold, insatiable desire to feed the monster that was growing inside him. As his reign of terror continued, the bodies began to pile up. The authorities were baffled. No witnesses, no suspects, just a string of disappearances that seemed to stretch across the town like a curse. Mendoza's killing spree was only getting started, and soon, no one would be safe from his bloodlust. As time passed, Andres Mendoza's confidence grew. He had tasted blood, and the hunger inside him became all-consuming. His kills were becoming more brutal, more sadistic. He began to experiment with his victims, testing his limits, seeing how much they could endure before they broke. The methodical precision of his earlier murders had given way to a more chaotic, violent frenzy. It wasn't just the women anymore. One man, a local who had been unlucky enough to cross Mendoza's path, became his next victim. The man had no idea what was happening when Mendoza approached him, offering help with a broken vehicle on the side of the road. But as soon as he was close enough, Mendoza attacked with terrifying precision, rendering his victim helpless. He dragged the man to a secluded spot where the real horror began. Andres Mendoza had no mercy, no empathy. The man pleaded for his life, but Mendoza showed no signs of stopping. He made the man watch as he mutilated his own body, savoring the screams that echoed in the night. When he was finished, the man's body lay in a crumpled heap, nothing but a broken shell of the person he had once been. But even that wasn't enough for Mendoza. He wasn't done yet. With each kill, his desire to consume grew stronger, until it became an unquenchable thirst. It wasn't just flesh he wanted anymore, it was control, power, dominance. The thrill of life being ripped away from his victims became his obsession. He wanted to feel the pulse of life slow down beneath his hands, to hear the last breath rasping from their throats. Soon, it wasn't just the flesh of his victims that he devoured. It was their very essence. The terror he instilled in them was what truly fed him. He was no longer satisfied with simply killing. He needed to watch them break, to see them suffer before they died. The brutality of his killings reached new heights, and the people of the town began to realize that something far darker was at play. But no one could stop him. Andres Mendoza was a predator, ruthless, cunning, and unstoppable. As the bodies piled up, the authorities scrambled to find any clue that could lead them to the monster in their midst. But Mendoza was always one step ahead, carefully covering his tracks, making sure that the police were always left in the dark. He was a ghost, slipping through the shadows, his presence felt only by the growing terror in the hearts of the townspeople. The killings continued, becoming more frequent, more horrifying. Each time, Mendoza's brutality seemed to escalate. His victims were no longer just women. They were anyone who crossed his path, anyone who became the object of his twisted desire. His hunger had no bounds, no limits, and with every kill, he grew stronger, more daring, more convinced that he was untouchable. By now, Andres Mendoza's killing spree had become a legend, a tale of horror whispered in hushed tones. No one dared speak his name aloud, but everyone knew who he was. The town had become his hunting ground, and the people lived in constant fear, knowing that they were just one step away from becoming his next victim. But Mendoza wasn't done yet. His bloodlust had taken a more macabre turn, and his latest victim was the most shocking of all, a young child. The brutal murder of an innocent, defenseless child sent shockwaves through the community, pushing the authorities into overdrive. They could no longer ignore the horror that was unfolding in their midst. But even as the manhunt intensified, Mendoza remained elusive, slipping through their grasp like a shadow. His madness knew no bounds. He didn't just kill for the sake of killing. He did it for the power, the thrill, the twisted pleasure of watching lives crumble beneath his hands. He began to leave behind clues, taunting the authorities, daring them to find him. It was as though he enjoyed the hunt, the game of cat and mouse, more than the kill itself. But the hunt was drawing to a close. The authorities were closing in on him, and the walls were starting to close in. They had begun to piece together the twisted puzzle of his crimes, and they were finally starting to understand the depths of his depravity. One final, fateful night, Andres Mendoza was cornered. The police, armed with newfound knowledge, tracked him down to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. But as they closed in on him, he fought back with a ferocity that no one expected. The standoff was brutal, a clash of wills between the authorities and a man who had become nothing more than a monster. In the end, it was over. Mendoza was captured, his reign of terror brought to a bloody end. But even as he was dragged away, shackled and broken, his eyes burned with an unholy fire, a fire that had consumed him, body and soul. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but even behind bars, he remained a symbol of the horrors that had unfolded in the dark corners of Mexico. Andres Mendoza may be behind bars, but his legacy lives on, a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity. His crimes were not just brutal. They were a manifestation of the darkest aspects of the human psyche, a horrifying testament to the evil that can lurk behind even the most ordinary of faces. His name will forever be associated with terror, a figure whose very existence sends shivers down the spine. The people of Mexico will never forget the nightmare that was Andres Mendoza, the man who murdered and cannibalized his victims in a frenzy of bloodlust. His story will live on, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never see coming. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 5. The Rancho Dominguez Predator. The Tracy Walker Story. When darkness falls over the sprawling urban wasteland of Rancho Dominguez, California, most people retreat behind locked doors and drawn curtains. But for those forgotten souls who call the streets their home, nightfall brings no sanctuary. Only the chilling possibility that death itself might be stalking through the shadows, wearing the face of an ordinary man. Tracy Walker appeared unremarkable to most who passed him on the street. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of person who blended seamlessly into crowds and disappeared from memory the moment he was out of sight. Yet behind those seemingly vacant eyes burned something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. A methodical, calculating hunger for violence that would transform him from a convicted killer into one of California's most ruthless predators of the homeless. Between 1991 and 2021, Walker carved a bloody trail through the most vulnerable members of society, targeting those whose disappearances would barely register as ripples in an already turbulent world. His victims shared more than just their circumstances. They shared the terrifying final moments of their lives, confronting a monster who saw their humanity as nothing more than an obstacle to his twisted satisfaction. This is the story of how a man with blood already on his hands slipped through the cracks of a system meant to protect society, emerging to hunt the defenseless with surgical precision and bone-chilling brutality. It's a tale that exposes the darkest corners of human nature and asks the haunting question: how many more victims might there have been if fate hadn't finally intervened? Welcome to the nightmare that unfolded on the streets of Rancho Dominguez. A nightmare that began with a single act of violence and escalated into a reign of terror that would leave families shattered, a community traumatized, and justice struggling to comprehend the full scope of one man's capacity for evil. The humid Los Angeles air hung thick with tension on that fateful day when Tracy Walker first tasted blood. Long before the streets of Rancho Dominguez would echo with the screams of the homeless, Walker's path to becoming a predator began with a single, devastating act of violence that would serve as both prologue and prophecy for the horrors to come. Voluntary manslaughter, the clinical term, barely captured the savage reality of Walker's first documented kill. The victim, whose name has been lost to time but whose death would prove to be just the opening chapter in Walker's bloody manuscript, never could have imagined that their final moments would be orchestrated by someone who would later perfect the art of killing society's most vulnerable members. The details of that initial murder remain shrouded in the bureaucratic language of court documents and police reports, but what emerged from the investigation painted a disturbing portrait of a man whose capacity for violence far exceeded what even seasoned homicide detectives had witnessed. Walker hadn't simply killed. He had done so with a methodical precision that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with taking a human life, even if it was his first time being caught. During the court proceedings, psychiatrists and behavioral analysts attempted to peer into Walker's mind, searching for the psychological mechanisms that could explain his actions. What they found was far more terrifying than any textbook profile of a killer. Walker exhibited what experts described as an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize his emotions, displaying no remorse for his victim while simultaneously presenting himself as a model defendant who understood the gravity of his actions. The prosecution argued that Walker's crime demonstrated clear premeditation and a disturbing lack of empathy that made him a permanent danger to society. They presented evidence showing how Walker had stalked his victim for days, studying their routines and identifying the perfect moment to strike. The murder itself had been executed with clinical efficiency. A quick, brutal attack that left no room for the victim to defend themselves or call for help. But perhaps most chilling was how Walker had behaved in the aftermath. Rather than fleeing the scene or showing signs of panic, he had methodically cleaned up evidence, disposed of the weapon, and created an alibi that might have held up if not for a single witness who had seen him leaving the area. This level of planning and post-crime organization suggested a mind that not only accepted violence as a solution but actively embraced it as a tool. Walker's defense team attempted to paint their client as a man driven to violence by circumstances beyond his control: childhood trauma, mental illness, societal pressures that had pushed him beyond his breaking point. They presented testimonies from family members who described a different Tracy Walker, one who had shown kindness to animals as a child and had volunteered at community centers in his teens. Yet as the trial progressed, a more sinister picture emerged. Former acquaintances testified about Walker's disturbing fascination with violence, his collection of true crime materials, and his habit of making casual comments about how easy it would be to make people disappear. One particularly damning testimony came from a former roommate who described finding detailed sketches in Walker's belongings, drawings that depicted various methods of killing and disposing of bodies. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of voluntary manslaughter, but not first-degree murder, a decision that would later be viewed as one of the most catastrophic failures of the justice system in California's history. Walker was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 8 years with good behavior. During his incarceration, Walker became what prison officials described as a model inmate. He participated in rehabilitation programs, earned his GED, and even completed several vocational training courses. To the outside observer, he appeared to be someone who had learned from his mistakes and was genuinely committed to rebuilding his life. Parole board members noted his articulate responses during hearings, his expressed remorse for his actions, and his detailed plans for reintegration into society. But those who worked most closely with Walker during his imprisonment saw glimpses of something far more disturbing. Prison guards reported that Walker had an unnatural ability to manipulate other inmates, often serving as a mediator in conflicts while simultaneously gathering information that he would later use to his advantage. He had created what psychologists would later describe as a perfect prison persona: charming, helpful, and completely fabricated. More troubling were the reports from prison librarians who noticed Walker's reading habits. While he publicly checked out books on rehabilitation and job training, he had also requested numerous volumes on forensic science, police investigation techniques, and criminal psychology. When questioned about these choices, Walker explained them away as academic curiosity, claiming he was considering a career in criminal justice after his release. The most chilling discovery came from a routine cell search conducted during Walker's 7th year of incarceration. Hidden inside a hollowed-out religious text, guards found dozens of newspaper clippings about unsolved murders, missing persons cases, and detailed articles about forensic investigation failures. Walker had been creating what amounted to a study guide for the perfect crime, analyzing cases where killers had escaped detection and identifying the mistakes that had led to others' captures. When confronted with this evidence, Walker maintained his innocence of any wrongdoing, claiming he was simply trying to understand the criminal mind as part of his rehabilitation process. The prison administration, already facing overcrowding issues and pressure to reduce recidivism rates, chose to interpret Walker's explanation charitably. The materials were confiscated. Walker received a minor disciplinary action, and the incident was filed away in his record as a footnote rather than a warning. As Walker's parole date approached, he underwent extensive psychological evaluation. The assessing psychiatrist noted Walker's high intelligence, his apparent understanding of social norms, and his expressed commitment to living a law-abiding life. The report concluded that while Walker would always carry the psychological scars of his crime, he had demonstrated genuine growth during his incarceration and posed a manageable risk to society with proper supervision. What the psychiatrist couldn't have known was that Walker had spent years perfecting his ability to tell evaluators exactly what they wanted to hear. He had studied the psychological profiles of successfully rehabilitated inmates, memorized the language of remorse and redemption, and crafted responses that would check every box on the parole board's assessment criteria. On a gray morning in late 1999, Tracy Walker walked out of the California State Prison System as a free man. He carried with him a small bag of personal belongings, a bus ticket to Los Angeles, and 8 years' worth of carefully cultivated plans for what he would do next. Prison officials watched him disappear into the crowd of commuters and families, completely unaware that they had just released a predator who had spent nearly a decade preparing for his return to the hunt. Walker's first few months of freedom were carefully orchestrated to maintain the illusion of successful rehabilitation. He found employment at a warehouse in downtown Los Angeles, rented a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, and dutifully reported to his parole officer every week. To everyone who observed him during this period, Walker appeared to be the success story that the rehabilitation system claimed to produce. But while Walker played the role of reformed criminal by day, his nights were spent on reconnaissance missions through the darker corners of Los Angeles. He mapped the locations where homeless populations gathered, studied police patrol patterns, and identified the areas where someone could disappear without attracting immediate attention. He was planning his next move with the same methodical precision that had characterized his first kill, but now he had years of accumulated knowledge about how to avoid detection. The transformation from model parolee to calculating predator didn't happen overnight. Walker understood that any dramatic change in his behavior would attract unwanted attention from his parole officer and potentially land him back in prison before he could accomplish his goals. Instead, he began a gradual process of expanding his hunting grounds and testing his abilities. His first post-prison violence was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. During one of his late-night wanderings, Walker encountered a homeless individual who was attempting to break into an abandoned building. Rather than reporting the incident or simply walking away, Walker approached the person and engaged them in conversation. What started as seemingly innocent dialogue quickly escalated when Walker realized how isolated they were and how unlikely it was that anyone would discover the body before morning. The attack was swift and brutal, executed with the efficiency that Walker had fantasized about during his years in prison. But what truly distinguished this killing from his earlier crime was Walker's emotional response, or rather, his complete lack of one. Where his first murder had been driven by anger and impulse, this kill was conducted with the cold calculation of someone who had discovered their true calling. Walker spent the remainder of that night methodically disposing of evidence and creating an alibi for his whereabouts. He had learned from his earlier mistakes and understood exactly how to minimize his chances of being connected to the crime. The body wouldn't be discovered for 3 days, and when it was, the investigation would be hampered by the victim's transient lifestyle and the lack of witnesses in the abandoned area where Walker had chosen to strike. As Walker returned to his apartment that morning, he felt a sense of completion that had eluded him throughout his years in prison. He had rediscovered his purpose, and more importantly, he had proven to himself that he could kill without consequence. The psychological barriers that might have prevented another person from escalating their violence had never existed for Walker. Prison had simply provided him with the time and motivation to perfect his methodology. The stage was now set for what would become one of California's most horrific killing sprees. Walker had evolved from an impulsive killer into a methodical predator, armed with years of planning and an intimate understanding of how to exploit society's blind spots. His victims would be chosen not for personal reasons, but for their vulnerability and society's tendency to overlook their disappearances. As the new millennium dawned, Tracy Walker began hunting in earnest, targeting a population that existed on the margins of society and whose deaths would barely register in the consciousness of a community already overwhelmed by urban violence and social problems. The nightmare of Rancho Dominguez was about to begin. The industrial sprawl of Rancho Dominguez stretched across the landscape like an urban scar, a forgotten corner of Los Angeles County where society's cast-offs gathered in the shadows of abandoned warehouses and beneath overpasses that hummed with the constant flow of traffic overhead. For Tracy Walker, now in his 30s and armed with a decade's worth of predatory planning, this desolate terrain represented the perfect hunting ground. A place where human life held so little value that entire populations could vanish without generating more than a perfunctory police report. Walker had chosen Rancho Dominguez with the same methodical precision that characterized every aspect of his criminal evolution. During months of careful reconnaissance, he had mapped the area's hidden encampments, identified the locations where homeless individuals gathered for safety and warmth, and most importantly, cataloged the spots where a body could lie undiscovered for weeks or even months. The homeless population that had gravitated to Rancho Dominguez represented society's most vulnerable members, people who had been systematically abandoned by family, failed by social services, and rendered invisible by a community that preferred to pretend they didn't exist. These were individuals whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation, whose deaths would be attributed to overdoses or exposure, and whose murders could easily be concealed among the urban decay that defined their daily existence. Walker understood that his success as a predator depended entirely on his ability to exploit these social blind spots. He had studied crime statistics during his imprisonment and knew that homicides involving homeless victims were solved at dramatically lower rates than those involving housed individuals. Police departments, overwhelmed by more visible crimes and lacking the resources to conduct extensive investigations into transient populations, often treated homeless deaths as natural consequences of street life rather than potential murders. His first victim in Rancho Dominguez was a man in his 50s whose identity would never be fully established. The individual had been living in a makeshift shelter constructed from shopping carts and tarps, hidden away in an industrial zone where security cameras were non-existent and foot traffic was limited to occasional police patrols. Walker had been observing this location for weeks, noting the victim's routines and confirming that he lived alone and maintained minimal contact with other homeless individuals in the area. The approach Walker used would become his signature methodology, a combination of false compassion and calculated violence that left his victims completely unprepared for what was about to happen. He would appear in the early morning hours, often carrying food or small supplies that immediately identified him as someone offering help rather than posing a threat. His victims' guard would drop as Walker engaged them in conversation, expressing concern for their welfare and asking about their needs. This psychological manipulation served multiple purposes beyond simply gaining his victims' trust. It allowed Walker to assess whether anyone else knew of the victim's location, determine if they were expected anywhere at a specific time, and identify any personal belongings or documentation that might complicate the investigation of their eventual disappearance. Most importantly, it provided Walker with a sense of complete control over the situation, the godlike power to determine whether this encounter would end in assistance or annihilation. When Walker finally struck, the violence was swift and overwhelmingly brutal. He had perfected a method of attack that combined maximum physical damage with minimal noise, understanding that even in these isolated areas, screams or sounds of struggle could potentially attract unwanted attention. The weapon of choice was always a knife, silent, efficient, and easily disposed of after each use. But Walker's methodology extended far beyond the actual killings. He had developed an elaborate post-murder routine that demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of forensic science and criminal investigation procedures. Bodies were moved from their initial attack sites to locations where natural decomposition and scavenger activity would eliminate most physical evidence. Personal belongings were scattered or disposed of in ways that would suggest robbery or random violence rather than targeted killing. The second Rancho Dominguez victim was discovered 3 weeks after Walker's initial kill, though the connection between the two deaths wouldn't be established for months. This victim, a woman in her 40s who had been struggling with addiction and mental illness, had been found by city workers conducting routine maintenance on storm drains. The positioning of her body and the extent of her injuries immediately indicated homicide, but the investigation was hampered by the same factors that had protected Walker during his first kill. Walker had learned from studying previous serial killers that the key to avoiding detection was varying his methodology just enough to prevent investigators from identifying a clear pattern while maintaining the core elements that made his crimes successful. With his second victim, he had altered the timing of his attack, the specific location of body disposal, and even the type of knife used in the killing, creating just enough variation to frustrate any attempts at criminal profiling. The psychological impact of Walker's crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims. Word of the murders had begun to circulate through Rancho Dominguez's homeless community, creating an atmosphere of terror that fundamentally altered how these vulnerable individuals approached their daily survival. Encampments that had previously offered safety through numbers began to disperse as people became afraid to trust even those they had known for months or years. Walker fed on this fear like a parasite, using the community's growing paranoia to his advantage. He understood that frightened, isolated individuals were even more susceptible to his offers of assistance and protection. The very terror he was creating served to deliver more victims directly into his hands, as desperate people became willing to trust anyone who appeared to offer refuge from the nightmare that had descended upon their world. His third victim represented Walker's most audacious kill to date, a homeless veteran who had maintained connections with local social services and was actively working to secure permanent housing. This individual should have been off-limits to a careful predator like Walker, as his disappearance was likely to generate more intensive investigation than previous victims. But Walker's confidence had grown with each successful murder, and he was beginning to believe himself invincible. The veteran's murder demonstrated the full extent of Walker's sadistic evolution. Rather than employing his usual swift killing method, Walker had prolonged the encounter, taking pleasure in his victim's fear and confusion as the horrific reality of the situation became clear. The physical evidence found at the scene suggested that the victim had been tortured before being killed, with wounds indicating that Walker had deliberately inflicted pain over an extended period. This escalation in violence reflected Walker's growing psychological dependence on the act of killing. What had begun as a calculated method of eliminating witnesses to his presence in the area had evolved into a compulsive need to experience the complete domination and destruction of another human being. Walker was no longer simply a predator hunting for survival. He had become something far more dangerous, a killer who murdered for the pure satisfaction of watching life drain from his victim's eyes. The discovery of the veteran's body triggered the first serious police investigation into the Rancho Dominguez murders. Unlike Walker's previous victims, this individual had been missed by people who cared about his welfare, and his death couldn't be easily dismissed as another casualty of street life. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, was assigned to lead the investigation and immediately recognized that the brutal nature of the crime suggested a serial killer was operating in the area. Martinez began by conducting extensive interviews with the homeless community, attempting to identify patterns in the recent deaths and gather intelligence about potential suspects. What she discovered was a population so terrorized by Walker's presence that many individuals had fled the area entirely, while those who remained were too frightened to provide detailed information about strangers they had encountered. The investigative challenges Martinez faced were enormous. The transient nature of the homeless population meant that potential witnesses had scattered across the greater Los Angeles area, making follow-up interviews nearly impossible. Physical evidence was limited by the environmental conditions where bodies had been discovered and the extended time periods between murders and investigations. Most frustratingly, the lack of permanent addresses or identification documents for many victims meant that establishing basic facts about their lives and movements proved extremely difficult. Walker monitored the police investigation with the same methodical attention he brought to planning his murders. He understood that Detective Martinez represented a genuine threat to his continued activities and began altering his behavior to avoid detection. His frequency of killing decreased, his victim selection became even more careful, and he implemented additional security measures to ensure he couldn't be connected to the crime scenes. But Walker's fundamental psychology prevented him from stopping entirely. The psychological satisfaction he derived from killing had become so central to his identity that complete abstinence wasn't psychologically sustainable. Instead, he began expanding his hunting grounds beyond Rancho Dominguez, traveling to adjacent areas where similar homeless populations existed and where his crimes wouldn't be immediately connected to the ongoing investigation. The expansion of Walker's killing spree represented a new and even more dangerous phase in his criminal evolution. No longer content with the methodical elimination of victims in a single geographic area, he had become a roaming predator whose crimes could span multiple jurisdictions and overwhelmed the investigative capabilities of individual police departments. The homeless populations of greater Los Angeles had become his personal hunting preserve, and Walker possessed both the intelligence and the motivation to exploit every vulnerability in the system designed to protect them. As 2001 progressed, Walker's confidence reached dangerous levels. He had successfully killed at least 6 individuals without facing any serious risk of capture, and his understanding of police investigative procedures had grown sophisticated enough that he believed himself capable of outwitting any pursuit. This overconfidence would prove to be the first crack in the armor of invincibility Walker had constructed around himself, setting the stage for the mistakes that would eventually lead to his downfall. The residents of Rancho Dominguez, both housed and homeless, had begun to sense that something predatory was moving through their community. Conversations in local businesses turned to whispered discussions about the recent deaths, and even hardened street veterans began altering their routines to avoid being alone in isolated areas. The community was living under siege, terrorized by a killer who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to strike without warning and disappear without a trace. By the dawn of 2002, Tracy Walker had transformed into something that defied conventional understanding of criminal behavior, a methodical architect of death whose murders had achieved a level of systematic precision that would have impressed forensic psychologists if they had been able to comprehend the full scope of his activities. Walker's evolution from impulsive killer to calculating predator represented 11 years of careful study, relentless practice, and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how society's blind spots could be exploited to facilitate mass murder. The homeless encampments of Rancho Dominguez had become Walker's personal laboratory, a testing ground where he refined his techniques and explored the boundaries of human suffering with the detached curiosity of a scientist conducting experiments on laboratory specimens. His victim count had reached double digits, though the exact number remained unknown even to Walker himself, as some of his earliest kills had been so expertly concealed that the bodies were never discovered. Walker's methodology had evolved into something approaching an art form, if art could be defined as the systematic destruction of human life for aesthetic pleasure. He had developed what behavioral analysts would later describe as a signature pattern that satisfied his psychological needs, while maintaining the operational security that kept him beyond the reach of law enforcement. Each murder followed a carefully choreographed sequence that began with extensive surveillance and concluded with the complete elimination of all evidence linking him to the crime. The surveillance phase of Walker's operations had become extraordinarily sophisticated. He would spend weeks observing potential victims, learning their routines, identifying their social connections, and mapping the territories they inhabited. Walker understood that successful predation required intimate knowledge of his prey, and he approached this requirement with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized every aspect of his criminal activities. During these surveillance periods, Walker would often engage his future victims in seemingly innocent conversations, presenting himself as a social worker, a religious volunteer, or simply another member of the homeless community who was concerned about their welfare. These interactions served multiple purposes. They allowed Walker to gather crucial intelligence about his victims' lives. They established his presence in the area as normal rather than suspicious, and they provided him with the psychological satisfaction of exercising complete control over individuals who had no idea they were speaking with their future killer. Walker's ability to blend into any environment had become one of his most dangerous assets. He possessed an almost chameleon-like capacity to adopt whatever persona was most appropriate for his current objectives, whether that meant appearing as a concerned citizen offering assistance or as another homeless individual seeking companionship and safety. This adaptability made him virtually impossible to identify as a consistent threat, as witnesses who encountered Walker in different contexts would often provide completely contradictory descriptions of his appearance and behavior. The killing phase of Walker's methodology had evolved far beyond the quick, efficient murders that had characterized his early crimes in Rancho Dominguez. Walker had discovered that he derived significantly more psychological satisfaction from prolonged encounters with his victims, and he had developed techniques for extending their suffering while minimizing the risk of attracting attention or leaving forensic evidence. Walker's preferred approach was to isolate his victims in locations where screams would be muffled or go unheard, then engage them in what he called conversations about death. He would explain to his victims exactly what he intended to do to them, describing in graphic detail the physical pain they were about to experience and the methods he would use to ensure their bodies were never found. This psychological torture often proved more devastating than the physical violence that followed, as Walker's victims were forced to confront the absolute hopelessness of their situation while maintaining the terror and desperation that fed Walker's need for complete domination. The physical violence Walker inflicted had become increasingly elaborate and sadistic. Rather than simply stabbing his victims to death, he had developed a repertoire of torture techniques designed to maximize pain while keeping his victims conscious for as long as possible. Walker had studied anatomy during his surveillance periods, learning exactly where to inflict wounds that would cause maximum suffering without triggering immediate death or unconsciousness. Walker's post-murder procedures had evolved into an elaborate ritual that served both practical and psychological purposes. The practical elements involved the methodical elimination of all forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene, including the removal or destruction of fingerprints, DNA samples, and any physical traces of his presence. Walker had become expert at using bleach solutions and fire to eliminate biological evidence, and he possessed detailed knowledge of how weather conditions and scavenger activity could be used to accelerate the decomposition of remains. The psychological elements of Walker's post-murder ritual were far more disturbing. He would often spend hours with his victims' bodies, positioning them in specific poses that satisfied his aesthetic preferences and taking mental photographs that he would later recall during periods when he was unable to kill. Walker had developed what he described to himself as a collection of these mental images, and he would often spend entire nights reliving his murders in excruciating detail. As Walker's kill count mounted, his confidence reached levels that bordered on supernatural arrogance. He had begun to view himself as an apex predator operating in an ecosystem where law enforcement served as ineffective park rangers, occasionally stumbling across evidence of his activities, but lacking the intelligence or resources to mount any serious threat to his operations. This overconfidence manifested itself in increasingly audacious criminal behavior, as Walker began taking risks that would have terrified his more cautious earlier self. One of Walker's most brazen acts occurred in early 2003, when he murdered a homeless individual within sight of an active police patrol. Walker had been following his victim for several days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike, when he noticed that the individual was about to enter an area that would take him beyond Walker's preferred hunting grounds. Rather than abandoning this particular target, Walker made the split-second decision to accelerate his timeline and conduct the murder despite the increased risk of detection. The kill took place in broad daylight, less than 200 yards from where two police officers were conducting a routine traffic stop. Walker approached his victim with his usual offer of assistance, quickly isolated him in a partially concealed loading dock area, and completed the murder in less than 3 minutes. The entire sequence was executed with such efficiency and Walker's escape was so expertly planned that the officers never realized a homicide had occurred less than 50 feet from their location. This murder represented a turning point in Walker's criminal career, as it demonstrated to him that he had achieved a level of operational sophistication that made him essentially untouchable. The psychological impact of successfully killing someone virtually under police supervision provided Walker with a sense of invincibility that would influence his decision-making for the remainder of his active period. Detective Sarah Martinez, meanwhile, had been developing her own theories about the pattern of murders plaguing Rancho Dominguez and the surrounding areas. Through painstaking analysis of crime scene evidence and extensive interviews with homeless community members, Martinez had begun to construct a profile of the killer that was remarkably accurate in its broad strokes, even if it failed to identify Walker specifically. Martinez understood that she was hunting someone with extensive knowledge of police investigative procedures and forensic science. The care with which evidence was eliminated from crime scenes indicated either law enforcement training or extensive self-education in criminal detection methods. The sophistication of the killer's victim selection suggested someone who had studied previous serial murder cases and understood how to exploit the investigative challenges posed by crimes against transient populations. Most disturbing to Martinez was her growing realization that the killer appeared to be escalating both in frequency and in the level of violence inflicted upon victims. Recent crime scenes had shown evidence of prolonged torture and ritualistic positioning of bodies that indicated the murders were becoming increasingly important to the killer's psychological satisfaction. Martinez recognized these patterns as warning signs that the killer was entering a phase where his compulsions might overwhelm his caution, potentially leading to even more brazen and frequent attacks. The investigative challenges Martinez faced were compounded by departmental resource limitations and competing priorities. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was dealing with budget cuts, personnel shortages, and pressure to focus resources on crimes that generated more public attention and political pressure. Homeless murders, regardless of their brutality or frequency, simply didn't command the same level of departmental commitment as crimes involving housed victims or those that occurred in more affluent communities. Martinez had begun conducting her own off-duty investigation, using personal time and resources to follow leads that the department couldn't officially pursue. She had developed a network of informants within the homeless community and had begun mapping the geographic and temporal patterns of Walker's crimes with a level of detail that exceeded anything in the official case files. Through this independent investigation, Martinez had identified several witnesses who had encountered a man matching Walker's general description in the vicinity of multiple crime scenes. The descriptions were frustratingly vague and often contradictory, but they suggested someone who was actively targeting homeless individuals and who possessed the social skills necessary to gain their trust before attacking. Martinez had also begun to suspect that the Rancho Dominguez murders were connected to similar crimes occurring throughout the greater Los Angeles area. She had identified at least a dozen additional homeless murders that shared enough characteristics with her cases to suggest they might be the work of the same killer. If her theory was correct, Walker's actual victim count was far higher than anyone had realized, and his hunting grounds encompassed a territory that spanned multiple jurisdictions. The bureaucratic obstacles to investigating a multi-jurisdictional serial killer were enormous. Different police departments often failed to share information effectively, and the lack of a centralized database for tracking crimes against homeless individuals meant that patterns could remain invisible even when they were occurring across adjacent communities. Martinez understood that Walker's success was as much a product of systemic failures in law enforcement coordination as it was of his individual cunning and preparation. As 2003 progressed, Walker's psychological state had begun to show signs of deterioration despite his continued operational success. The intervals between murders had decreased significantly, suggesting that his compulsive need to kill was becoming more powerful than his rational understanding of the risks involved. Walker had also begun experiencing what he described to himself as hunting dreams, elaborate fantasies about future murders that occupied his thoughts during periods when he wasn't actively stalking victims. These psychological changes were accompanied by behavioral alterations that made Walker increasingly visible to the communities where he operated. Several homeless individuals had reported encounters with a man who asked unusually detailed questions about their living situations, their social connections, and their daily routines. While none of these encounters had resulted in immediate violence, they had created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that was beginning to interfere with Walker's ability to approach potential victims. Walker's response to these challenges was to expand his hunting grounds even further, traveling throughout Southern California in search of homeless populations that hadn't been warned about his activities. This expansion brought him into contact with investigative jurisdictions that had no knowledge of the Rancho Dominguez murders and no reason to suspect that a serial killer was operating in their territories. The stage was now set for the final phase of Walker's criminal career, a period that would see his most audacious murders, his closest calls with capture, and ultimately the mistake that would bring his reign of terror to an end. Walker had reached the peak of his abilities as a predator, but he had also reached the psychological point where his compulsions were becoming stronger than his survival instincts, setting up the conditions for his eventual downfall. The summer of 2019 brought an oppressive heat to Southern California that seemed to press down upon the sprawling urban landscape like a suffocating blanket. But for Tracy Walker, now approaching his 60th year and having perfected his craft across nearly 3 decades of systematic murder, the weather provided perfect cover for his increasingly frequent hunting expeditions. Walker had evolved far beyond the careful predator who had first stalked the streets of Rancho Dominguez. He had become something approaching a force of nature, a human embodiment of death that moved through society's margins with the confidence of someone who believed himself truly untouchable. Walker's victim count had long since exceeded any accurate tallying, with bodies scattered across multiple states and jurisdictions in a pattern so diffuse that no single investigative agency had been able to comprehend the full scope of his activities. Conservative estimates placed his kill count in the dozens, but Walker himself had lost precise track of the number, as many of his victims had been so expertly concealed that their remains would never be discovered. For Walker, the individual murders had begun to blur together into a continuous narrative of domination and destruction that had become the defining characteristic of his existence. The psychological transformation Walker had undergone was as complete as it was terrifying. Where once he had killed to satisfy specific compulsions or eliminate potential witnesses, he now murdered simply because the act of taking life had become as natural and necessary to him as breathing. Walker no longer experienced the careful planning periods that had characterized his earlier crimes. Instead, he moved through the world in a state of constant readiness to kill, identifying and eliminating targets with the casual efficiency of someone swatting insects. This psychological shift had been accompanied by a dangerous deterioration in Walker's operational security. The methodical caution that had protected him for decades had been gradually replaced by a reckless confidence born from years of successful kills and narrow escapes. Walker had begun to believe that his experience and intelligence made him fundamentally superior to law enforcement, and this arrogance was manifesting itself in increasingly careless behavior that left more evidence and attracted more attention with each passing month. Detective Sarah Martinez, now a lieutenant with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and widely recognized as one of California's leading experts on crimes against homeless populations, had never stopped investigating what she now called the invisible killer case. Martinez had spent the better part of 2 decades mapping Walker's activities, and her unofficial case files contained evidence linking him to more than 40 murders across 7 states. She had become obsessed with capturing Walker, not just as a professional obligation, but as a personal mission that had consumed much of her adult life. Martinez's investigation had evolved far beyond traditional police work. She had developed relationships with homeless advocacy groups, social workers, and medical examiners throughout the western United States, creating an informal intelligence network that fed her information about suspicious deaths and missing persons cases. Martinez understood that Walker's success depended on society's indifference to homeless deaths, and she had made it her mission to ensure that these victims weren't forgotten or ignored. The breakthrough in Martinez's investigation came from an unexpected source: a forensic genealogy analysis conducted by a private laboratory that specialized in identifying victims of violent crimes. A partial DNA profile recovered from one of Walker's crime scenes in 2017 had been processed through genealogical databases, and the results had identified several potential. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.